Chapter 8 The Cleansing Fires. The assault that Elof feared did not come. He sent a guarded warning to Nithade, without saying why. It is some tribute to his standing with the king that he was taken seriously. Nithade alerted his march wardens, but they reported no signs of any great mustering of their foes. On the contrary, the Ekwesh armies were, if anything, dividing their numbers, avoiding battle, and returning to their raiding habits. More often now, they would strike in small bands at weaker targets, as they had at Elof's village in Norderney. They seemed less eager than before to lay siege to strong places and larger towns. Nithade was once more kept busy chivying his forces from one town to the next to reinforce the house troops of his lords. But he had fewer pitched battles to face. To Elon Gorenhayan he returned an impatient answer. Elof was left furrowing his brow with worry. What then had been Kara's mission, if not to spy out some assault? For mission there must have been, and a grave one. Lohi would hardly have loosed her for less, knowing she might turn such freedom to her own ends. Why did she come, then? He muttered, staring up at the sky, as it lost its deep sapphire luster and took on the misty sheen of a pearl. For 3 nights now he had waited, sitting cold and forlorn on a bench against the stone wall of the forge, sleepless even after long days of toil restoring the furnace. But he had seen nothing, not so much as the sweep of wings across the paling stars. What was she seeking?
"Has it occurred to you," said Rock's voice behind him, "that it might have been you?"
Elof looked around in surprise. His friend was as fond of his sleep as all other comforts, and rarely rose this early save at great need. Of course, she turned aside to seek me out, though whether out of scorn or spite or something more, I still can't guess.
"No," said Rock, treading carefully. "I mean that she didn't turn aside from her mission, that she fulfilled it, that a certain lady gave her the order to seek out you."
"I?" Elof laughed.
"Surely not, Rock. Once, perhaps.
But what would the warlord of the Great Ice want with me now? Why should she come hunting one crippled smith after 6 long years? How could she even know I still lived, let alone here of all places? And surely Kara would not.
"You won't face it, will you?" demanded Rock, less carefully. "The turn in the war, all your fine new walls and weapons. You can wager Lohi's taken good mind of those. Wouldn't be that hard for her to guess where they've sprung from all of a sudden. Whose hand lay behind them? What more likely than yours? All but branded your name on 'em, you have, for those with eyes to read."
Elof was silent, and Rock pressed home his attack.
"Then she'd have prisoners to torture. Maybe even spies of Brihon's ilk to call on. What'll they tell her? Rumors, aye, but think of them. Some outland sorcerer, a cripple. She might think she'd done that. And Gorthar? By the high gate. Nithade, new-armored and wielding a black sword. Then she'd know all right. Do you ask yourself what she'd do then?"
"Why have I been so blind?" demanded Elof of himself. "Why did I not see this for myself?"
Because you wouldn't credit that Kara could hunt you,
said Rock somberly. Elof shook his head. Still, I cannot. Not for Lohi. Not even after. He bit his lip savagely. Why would she show herself to us if she was hunting us? I cannot credit it.
And yet, once she came close to slaying us all at Lohi's behest,
said Rock quietly,
though bravely she broke that bond.
He grimaced, disliking what he had to say.
But only with your help. That lost. Why should she now have any greater strength?
Because of what is past, said Elof, clutching his hand convulsively to his breast. Long years. Longer even than this unending thraldom. This imprisonment in a maimed shell. Can they all count for nothing at all? Rock regarded him gravely.
In another man's mouth, and of any other woman than her, that might sound more foolish. Happen you're right. I hope you are. But dare you trust in that? And does it matter? Whether she hunted us by design or found us by chance, think you she could keep it from Lohi?
Silence fell, save for the small noises of the night. It was a long time before Elof finally shook his head. No, you have the right of it. Lohi would crumble her will like a dry rind. He slammed a fist against the doorpost. That was why she left the token. She couldn't help herself, but she wanted at least to warn us we had been found, that something might follow. What, I wonder? Rock rasped a thumb across his chin.
A strike like lightning, I'd guess. A sudden swift raid. To bear you off, or slay you. Here. This raising they're about. Maybe they're just limbering up.
Elof frowned. Surely not. That would be folly for them. Let the first strike fail, and they alert us all. Nethade would spirit me away at once, perhaps to Karis the city. And how would they find me again among all that great hive of humanity? Lohi will have something else in mind, something surer, slower, maybe. She thinks like the ice, but more sure. I cannot guess what.
But we've got to,
Rock protested.
So we can do something. We can't just squat here and wait.
Elof rose up on his crutches. Any move could be the wrong one when we know so little. Save one. And that is to escape Lohi and Nethade together, as we planned to. All Kara has done is make our need more urgent. He frowned suddenly and thrust a hand within the breast of his jerkin. Unless
what?
I cannot be sure. But one thing I know. We have that furnace now, and no excuse for not using it. He stretched his back, swaying alarmingly, and clapped Rock on the shoulder. Rock groaned.
Will you not even snatch an hour or two of sleep, lest you lose the habit?
Elof laughed. Was it not you who was so eager to do something? Well then, bestir yourself. The ice itself is on our track. The forge roared as he hauled a last time on the bellows lever, and the light swelled among the heaped coals. He seized a bar of steel in his tongs and drew it out, sparking and sputtering white, just on the edge of burning itself. Then he swung about on his crutches, laid it against the anvil's edge, and snatched up a heavy hammer. Down on the steel he brought it in swift, bouncing blows, never letting the metal settle as he twisted it this way and that, humming to himself all the while a tune, light and rippling, yet with an eerie undertone that took on words in his mind. Hark to the words of the one that shapes you. Know you the sound that is struck into you. Look that you hold what is laid upon you. Fail you shall not, nor the flames consume you. All the fires of earth restraining, all the heat of hell enchaining. So at the last to my words you hearken. Hear that the moment I choose is come. The steel wormed and twisted beneath his ceaseless blows as if he tormented something living, till at last he laid it over the anvil's beak and stilled it with 2 smart raps before plunging it swiftly into the trough. And even then it seemed to shriek among the steam. After a few minutes he drew it forth, and leaning on his crutches, he turned to the open door of the furnace. Very slowly and laboriously he clambered over the lip, swinging himself over by his hands and barking his weakened shins painfully. But he was all too used to that by now. He longed for a rail to help him down the steps, but any metal he could think of able to withstand the furnace would hold its heat too long and be deadly dangerous. He had to make do with the rough handholds they had cut in the wall, and sockets for his crutches in the steps and the sloping floor beyond.
You all right?
Echoed Rock's voice from below, as it had 100 times in the last few weeks.
I manage,
was Elof's gruff reply, as it had been just as often. They both knew it was not true, but it suited Elof to act as if it was. Before they found the forge, he had grown at least partly reconciled to his condition, but the difficulties of working on it had revived all his raw resentment. "Here," he said, when at last he reached the floor and tossed the bar to Rock, who caught it deftly and began to clean and file it to a close fit with the mechanism he was working on. Elof hobbled slowly across the sloping floor to join him, then leaned against the wall, mopping his brow. "You're a fine artificer," he said more cheerfully, leaning over Rock's shoulder. "That's as good a job as I could have done."
"Save that you'd have had it sit up and beg,"
puffed Rock, reaching for a finer file. A few strokes more, and he wormed his way on hands and knees into the reopened cavity till only his substantial rear protruded.
"And how you made it so close a fit."
"I measured the bar closely to start with," said Elof. "I knew how the heat would expand it, and while it was hot, I looked among the crystals in the Duergar fashion, and saw where to lay each blow."
"Is quite beyond me, I was about to say."
A chain clanked suddenly.
"That's it. Snug and in place. Well, there's the air shaft mechanism, counterweight and all. Your furnace is yours for the testing any time."
He reappeared, brushing grime out of his thick thatch of hair.
Ooh, how'd you like your soot? Congealed, caked, or just plain loose and powdery? Do you take your fancy?
There's a great deal of it, remarked Elof thoughtfully.
Only just noticed that. Times were when we were working down here, I thought we'd kill every fish in the great river bathing at the day's end.
Yes, but why? There's more here than there should have been if he was only burning coal or wood with the earth fires. And it's too pure, some of it. As if the soot itself was part of what he was creating. Almost as if he were seeking to reduce it somehow. Rock raised his eyebrows.
Soot? What use might that be to a smith? More like a curse to this one.
You did not study among the Duergar, or in Morvenhall. The pure stuff of such a burning has many uses. For one, it may change steel, smelted deep among its very crystals. So was Kermorven's sword made, that can hew plain iron unscathed. And when very pure, it can be formed into many strange substances. It was Marja who reminded me of that long since. Wood or coal will yield it, but more easily still stone's blood, that is their cousin. The Duergar know of many. Some of the true mastersmiths in Karis of old made trial with the stuff, and I have many of their accounts among Amelis's library. I may be able to improve upon their methods. In fact, it was some of these I meant to try here first, for this furnace is so well suited, so that now, by all the powers, I begin to wonder if that smith of old was not upon the same trail. Suddenly, he snapped his fingers, and reached up to one of the wall ledges so sharply that he all but overbalanced. Clouds of soot flew up as he swept his hand impatiently along it. "Not that one," he muttered, brushing another. "Nor this."
"Are you out to choke the pair of us?"
coughed Rock. But Elof paid him no heed, scraping along the shelves of stone till at last his hand closed upon that same smooth hank that he had first felt. "This," he hissed. "By all the powers! It can't be! And yet, what else? Spun! Spun!"
"It's not hair, that's for sure,"
muttered Rock, tugging at a loose strand and managing only to cut his finger.
"Is this one of your strange substances, then?" "You never know, it might well be. I've never seen or heard of anything like it before, and I'll wager you haven't either."
Elof rifled the glossy stuff between his fingers. "Then you might lose," he murmured. "I think. I'm not sure, mind you. I think that I have heard and seen."
"Among the Duergar, I suppose,"
grunted Rock, but Elof shook his head. "No. They knew of something like it, but they did not make it. Can you not tell by the very look of the stuff? And by the very feel of it? Powers! It burns in my hand."
"Seems cool enough to me,"
muttered Rock in surprise, stroking it gingerly.
"Just black, shiny, fine, and sharp as.
His voice tailed away, and when he looked up into Elof's face, his ruddy cheeks had paled beneath their sooty crust.
Gorthar?
He whispered, and Elof inclined his head. Remember what I told you once? Of those moments when I poured the lightning down upon it? And of what I saw? Rock's voice fell very quiet.
That it was no single substance at all, but made of a tangle of fine filaments, compressed somehow.
Into a sword. My sword. Someone's sword before me. Whose? I hardly dare think. Rock whistled and hefted the hank in his fingers.
So that's the seeker of that blade, huh?
He twisted it in his muscular hands.
Stronger than steel it could well be. So likely it was some smith of Caris made it then, by binding filaments like these.
No, said Elof dully, staring beyond him into nothingness. Not like these.
But you said,
not like these. These. Rock dropped the filaments as if they had turned to snakes.
What? Don't be daft, man. How can you be so sure?
The gauge of them is the same. I've held that sword too long not to know the stuff of it again. I feel it, Rock. I can feel the blade in my grasp, even as we stand here.
I think you've shed your wits,
barked Rock, backing away.
There must still be some bad air here.
No, Rock. You never know, you said. But for once, I do know. It is not only a feeling. Do you look on those shelves behind you and see again what we saw when first we came down here?
Old vessels, pitchers, molds, sword molds by Hela's tresses.
He snatched one off the shelf and held it up, then turned to Elof with a look of dawning understanding.
It's much like the shape of Gorthar. Much. But it's not the same. Not wholly.
No, said Elof quietly. The crystal lamp was beginning to dim. The light of day it had gathered to fade. From the corners of that ancient furnace, the long shadows were beginning to close in. That one was flawed. You were not quite tall enough. And he reached high over Rock's broad shoulder, to where the shorter man saw a sudden gleam among the disturbed soot. He who labored here was a taller man than either of us, and I would guess a better smith. But even he had his failures. And from the long-neglected shelf, amid a cloud of soot, he drew forth a twin-to-the-black blade, bare-tanged and gleaming, as he had first drawn it from the marsh, from the hand of one centuries dead, save that midway down it was warped and cracked, as if some impatient hand had wrung it and flung it disgustedly aside.
Vade?
Rock's growl had thinned to a dry whisper, and it trembled. Elof had seen him stand indomitable against so much, but he feared the dead. "No!" cried Elof, himself desperately afraid as the only friend left him, back from him to the stairs. I tell you, no. I am only who I am, whom you have known. Alv, Elof, that's all. Not some long-dead necromancer. Of that, at least, I was never more sure.
But you are linked with him,
breathed Rock heavily, and suddenly he began to shout.
Can you deny it now? Dare you? What then? Did he come visit you in that marsh? Has his power reached down the years to you and shaped your destiny? Do you dance to a dead man's strings, that his blade you wield, his furnace you have found, his very face you wear?
Elof stood dumbfounded in the sooty air, swaying before this assault, helpless and confused. I don't know, he cried. I don't know. Rock, I'm as unnerved as you are. More. Help me, Rock, or I'll be truly lost. Rock stopped in his tracks and ran his hands down his forge apron. Soot crusted on the sweat in his palms. He breathed like one who has run a long course.
I tell you straight, he said, I'd half a mind to be up those stairs and slam down that door.
And what then? Said Elof bitterly. Open the other doors? Rock hung his head.
I don't know. Half a mind, maybe. I'd have thought better of it once I'd got my wind back.
He picked up the lamp, now scarcely brighter than a glow in that gloom.
Hell, man. Let's get out of here, into the clean air. This murk's got into our minds. I wish to hell I'd never come down here. I never will again. And no more should you.
I agree, my friend, sighed Elof, as Rock gingerly helped him up the steps. But I must. What was made here must be made again. Or our doom may yet be more certain. Have you forgotten our need?
No. But what makes you so sure the answer's in this pit of sorcery? The makings of another sword? It'll take more than that to set us free.
Elof shook his head, too spent to speak.
What then? The Tarnhelm again? Do you think you can shape another such out of that stuff better than you can from metal? For I can think of naught else you were sure of.
Again, Elof shook his head. But as they came to the door, he reached within his tunic, where he kept Kara's token, and drew out something that slipped from his grasp and fluttered to the ground like a golden leaf. Rock stooped to it, and gazed up at Elof in greater awe than before.
You can't mean... You do. Well, I've said once or more than once I'd believe anything of you. But this...
A shadow crossed his face.
You're not meaning I should.
He could not continue. But Elof shook his head and smiled. No, indeed. Have we not said often enough that you should get free with ease? Nithade hardly cares about you. I am the halter about your throat, and to me it falls to take the risk, or perish in trying. But whatever befall, you will still have a part to play. A hard and a dangerous one. Rock grinned and rubbed his hands. His fright had drained out of him.
So long as we're getting somewhere at last.
We may be. But who knows how much time is left us? Kara showed us that, whatever she intended, and perhaps also pointed us our way. But it is not yet ours to take. He slammed the sloping door of the furnace and twisted the screws that held it tight. Then he turned to the remade mechanism and began to wind the wheel. The soft, dragging squeal of the doors and their runners echoed up, setting Elof's teeth on edge. Then beneath their feet a dragon coughed, and the stone quivered to a vast, remote roaring. Rock watched tensely as he wound the wheel still wider and set in motion the water wheel that drove the air vents. They both kept a tense eye upon a row of tall stems rising from the ground along the length of the furnace. Stalks of dark metal set about with leaves of gold. In seconds, no more, the first leaves quivered and began to curl in upon themselves, and the second soon followed. But only when the leaves of the third were curled tight did Elof spin the wheel backward to close the doors below. The whine of the air shafts died, and a last puff of vapor came spurting up through the vents, mephitic and biting, before Rock was able to close them and choke off the growl of the unquiet earth beneath.
Well, they work, by all the powers, exclaimed Elof,
peering through streaming eyes at the writhing leaves. He had shaped them from webs of many metals laid together in layers, often gossamer thin, and with many virtues worked into them, of consistency not the least. Each layer was chosen carefully to expand at a different speed under the heat that rose up the stem from its roots in the furnace roof, and so pull and twist each leaf this way or that, gauging for those above the intensity of the fires below. He frowned slightly. Fiercer even than I had expected for so brief a firing. We must take care, Rock. Vade, or whoever it was, a brave man who worked this forge before.
Or a cracked one. Unless the fires are burning hotter since his day. It's a long time since, remember?
Maybe. But wouldn't they rather have cooled, being so close to the air?
Why should they, when nothing else has?
What do you mean?
Don't you remember how Trikar said the fire mountains have grown fiercer since his grandfather's day? And I've heard others say the same, as if the land itself was warring with the ice. Leave it, man. It's safe for now. Do you come outside for some air and a drop to celebrate? My face'll fall off if I don't get a stoop of wine into it.
But they had to walk some way from the forge, for that last exhalation from the vents still hung in a dark cloud in the still air, and the oak trees drooped with darkness on their leaves. Elof watched it, preoccupied, till the reviving river breeze whisked it away like the remnants of a dark vision. Only then did he feel at all like celebrating. To our labors, he said crisply, clinking his goblet against rocks. For though now I know the thing I need can be made, and I have the furnace to make it, yet it may be a while before we have cause for toasts again. In that he was a true prophet, for all through spring into summer ran his trials, and more frustrating they grew. Many and subtle were the stratagems he was driven to devise, the compoundings, blendings, reducings he had to essay in the search to shape anew that hair-like filament with the dark sheen. A dark miasma hung often over the forge, and the small beasts of the island fled its environs. Once the very spring was poisoned below the forge. The fish died in its outflow. The swans came no longer to the quiet pools, nor the little mammoths to wallow and spout. Elof, for all his desperation, was grieved at this, and more careful in the future, even devising measures to shield the trees from the airs of the furnace. But he did little else, and had his master been more demanding, he could hardly have escaped detection. Nethaid, though, had other and more pressing concerns, for the Eqesh went on as they had begun, harrying the lands in small bands that did less actual harm than before, yet wrought havoc and spread panic by their very elusiveness. Nor had they any need to slacken their campaign in the summer months, as when they were mustered in a full army, for a part of each clan could direct the thrall-gathered harvests in turn, while the rest were raiding. Only where Elof's new fortifications stood were the raids blunted, for they rarely dared afford the time to lay siege to a town so defended. And the labyrinthine barrier, as it spread, blocked the quick influx and escape upon which their strategies depended. When Nethaid could fall upon such a band of raiders heavily engaged against a town, or trap them between the slender garrison of the barriers and his own army, he wiped them out to a man. But otherwise, he was left floundering with his heavy forces from place to place, after reavers who darted in and out like fish nibbling a bait. Only by surprise and good fortune could he intercept them, and he seemed to be having less of both. In many places he left garrisons, but one might fall into undisturbed idleness, another be overwhelmed by unusually large numbers, another worn away by repeated harassment. All were equally destructive. Often he had to face minor mutinies among his levies when they heard of their homelands being pillaged, while they were kept chasing some elusive threat halfway down the border. All this grew worse, and his standing, which by Elof's creations and his own fierce energy had been greatly enhanced of late, began once again to suffer. Even his own warriors grew louder in their grumbles, and more ready to remember that for all his claims to Ysmerian blood, he held the throne by the right of a usurper only, and that through a Ysmerian great-grandfather his children had a better right than he. Even at his court, since he was so often absent, this came to be said openly, and less than eagerly discouraged by his sons. So Rock reported, for as often as ever he went abroad to aid in the fortifications, and Elof was left to his lone and gloomy labors. It was from one such excursion that he returned, early in the next winter, that was the 7th of Elof's thraldom, and found his friend seated at their table with a great mass of filament before him, and a strange smile on his face. He was clad as if to celebrate in some of the fine garments that Nethaid had sent them. But Rock did not fail to notice how stiffly and gingerly he rose, nor that his crutches were new and of steel, nor that the end wall of the forge had a stained and blackened cast to it, as from the passage of great heat. As Elof offered him his hand in greeting, he took the arm instead, and saw Elof wince as he gripped the bandages beneath. Looking closely, he saw that his friend's cheeks had a sheen to them as of new scarring, tight and papery.
"You've been doing it, haven't you, you daft bastard?"
Rock hissed, gripping harder in his anger.
"Going down there to work, and all by yourself. Fired your bloody clothes, didn't you, huh?"
"It was the only way," said Elof faintly, and sat down, clutching his arm. "The only way untried. The lesser the wound, the slower it is to heal. So it is with me, I think. No grave burns, but many scorches. That is all. And it is done, Rock. Done. I have burned the rock oil with minerals to its finest form and spun it into thin chains of matter, crystals finer than thread. Was that not worth a flame from the fires? The filament is made anew, and with it, our hopes." Rock shook his head resignedly.
"The filaments, maybe, but all the rest? How will you come by the materials you need? Crystals take time to grow. And where can you find enough gold for?"
"That taxed me also," said Elof, smiling darkly once more. "But no longer. Nithaida's returned. Have you heard?"
"Aye, he had me to the palace, to quiz about the state of the fortifications. He is hard-pressed, that one. He leaves the field only to tighten his grip on the heartlands and raise more money for the campaigns. It's rumored he plans a new minting of coinage."
"He does," said Elof, still smiling. "But he has need of my aid with it. Last week that slime-ridden lord, his treasurer, came calling on me with great chests of gold, his knees knocking at the very sight of me. But still he demanded that I use my arts to so debase the stuff as to increase it by a quarter, and leave even the minters unable to tell. Wonderful, is it not? To what heights I am elevated in the hands of this king. He makes me his thrall, his murderer, and now his counterfeiter. A noble advancement, is it not?"
"Tell him you can't do it,"
urged Rock, outraged.
"It's no more than the truth."
"I sent word back that I could, and would," rejoined Elof. Rock shook his head in surprised disgust.
"But, man, can you do it?"
"I believe so. Oh, that reflects less on the skills in me than the lack of them in the coiners. They would scarce notice if the gold were debased by half, so long as it took their die stamps prettily enough."
"By half?"
exploded Rock, and then he began to chuckle.
"You'd better be right, my lad."
"About the coiners?"
"About your plan. Make the best of that gold, for I fear you're going to need it. But whence comes the other stuff?"
"I sent word I needed that for the coining. The first boatload arrived this morning." Rock stared at him wide-eyed and exploded into laughter.
"He's fostered your felon's instincts only too well, I see."
But Elof's smile did not change, and Rock understood suddenly that it was rigid with self-disgust. "He has. And if one day it should lead me to forget that I am a master smith and no common assassin, be it upon his head. The winter that came was harder even than those before, and it was among banks of snow and bitter winds that Elof entered the 8th year of his thraldom. He scarcely noticed. He was too busy, laboring with Rock upon the king's gold, or by himself in the depths of the furnace chamber. Rock was glad to see that his burns were healing, and that he took no further such risks. He seemed to feel now that he had greater cause to keep himself as whole and ready as he could. Only at times, when he could not sleep of a night, he would go stand hip-deep in the snow that not even the rising earth fires could dispel now, and gaze long into the skies, whether clouded or frost-clear, and for that Rock hardly had the heart to rebuke him. But he saw no more wings. It seemed that Kara had vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. Chests of gold went ashore and were received at the mint without complaint. The more so as Elof had set within the tainted gold a potency which might cloud a prying mind. The new-made blanks rang as clear and heavy as any pure gold between the dies. Upon one face, as was customary, the sign of the sun between the horns was set, but upon the other was shown Nithade in his armor, bestriding a dying Equesh warrior, for he wished the coins to embody the confidence of his realm and rule. And so it does, said Elof bitterly, for it is as false at heart. More false even that he himself suspects. He let the coin slip through his fingers onto the table, and from there roll unregarded to the floor, and wiped one hand against the other as if to shed the taint. Then, gathering his crutches, he heaved himself upright, swung towards the door, and slammed it behind him in an icy blast of air. Rock looked after him and shook his head sadly, but he did not neglect to pick up the coin and stow it carefully in an inner pocket. Elof floundered out through the snow, climbing laboriously to the summit of the hill, drinking in deep draughts of the clean air as if to wash out the clinging taint of dishonesty. A cold north wind had scoured the sky to a dome of onyx, traced with diamond, glittering and hard. The oaks looked suddenly aged, for the snow clung to their bare branches in place of missing foliage, and they drooped beneath its weight. In summer, this little grove was a place of peace for him, a green shade where he could lie and be lulled by the drone of insects and the thousand shifting shadings of the broad leaves. Stark and cold now, it held little promise of peace for him, and yet it helped strangely to lean his aching head against the coolness of the gnarled bark, and know that somewhere beneath life and growth went on in hope, readying for the spring that was not far off. He had done well to spare these ancient trees. You did well indeed. Elof jerked back from the trunk as if it had burned him, and barely kept his balance on his crutches. The voice was impossibly faint and distant, vast as a wind over infinite forests, the surcease of unnumbered tossing treetops, and blowing like them in gusts that came and went. Yet he heard each word clear in his mind, and knew who it was who spoke. You again. I indeed. I am glad you remember me. Moss and creeper invade that cunning forge you built in my realm. Dead leaves blow over the floor, gather, and rot to fertile earth. Seeds swell and split among the crannies of the walls. Roots slither under flagstones. Small beasts tunnel beneath the cold hearth. In the spring gales the roof shall fall at last. You may wall out the forest, but you cannot keep it at bay for long. What do you do here, so far from that realm? Demanded Elof, seeing his breath smoke against the trunk. If you've come only to mock me, I have not come anywhere. I am here, as I am where stands even the smallest sapling of a tree. And I do not seek to mock you, or enchain your heart as before. As the world is now, we have common cause. And I speak only to bring warning. Elof snorted. Warning? What have you to warn me of? Who set me such a snare? Heed me none the less. Too gravely stands the cause of life to let any enmity divide its defenders now. If you could bring some kind of help, I might believe you. You must believe me. I can give you no help. I must put forth the utmost of my strength even to speak in this land of men that has slain its trees. I can only bear warning. Then, a message. Could you not bear one to my own land? To Cairn Kermorvant, its king? There are trees enough. But none to hear their voices. Few hear me, save at the edge of thought, who have not dwelt long in my realm, or trafficked otherwise with the powers. You have tasted the blood of the worm. That is a minor power embodied. And you have your smithcraft. That is the gift of a power to men. Few have as much in your Eastlands. None. Elof caught his breath. But you can see that land? Then do you tell me at least how my friends there fare? How stands their realm? I beg of you. For a moment, no answer came, only silence. Then, in a sudden gust, the great voice called again. I look, and it is well. Though trees are felled, others are sown. The land is tended, and not laid to waste. A land of peace, a land that looks to the coming years. A wise land. Were all such, I would have less quarrel with your kind. I see men and Duergar meet in harmony beneath the trees, and praise their lords who drew them from the west. Of the city I see little among stone, but on the shore are stood 2 watchers more. You would know their likeness. I can see no more. The sudden heat of tears over his cold cheeks startled him. I thank you, Lord of Forests. It is more than enough. Of what then would you warn me? Of one more thing I cannot clearly see. For in the realms of the ice less grows even than among the stones men raise. Yet something is stirring. Moss and lichen feel it, and the seeds that sleep beneath the frozen ground against the day of its withdrawing. They are my spies, and they bring me word. The ice prepares to tip the balance at last, and this is the place appointed. Against Tawen-Tar I cannot stand, where trees are so few. But you, who break the wills of powers upon your anvil, it may be that you can. It is laid upon you to try. But how? What will the ice do? It is too far off to strike a spearhead against Karis as against Morven. It is nearer than you may think. Already Taun's ground ice gnaws the roots of my highland forests, and they falter. This winter will be long, but the next one will seem to have no end. Then, sometime in the summerless months that must follow, the glaciers themselves will throw their weight upon the scales. Abruptly, the voice broke off and grew harsh and shrill as a storm wind.
One is here who listens. I speak no more. You know enough. Reflect in care and fear.
The silence was as sudden and absolute as the slamming of some distant door. Wait, who listens? Elof whirled around wildly, searching the tree shadows. He fought for balance and toppled into the crisp snow, his crutches clattering apart. The icy chill on his neck was so sudden it was terrifying. He felt his heart race, his breath grow shallow. So strong was the presence of being watched closely, intently. His mind flooded with thoughts of those terrors, thin and shadowy, that stalked the outlands on just such nights as these. He had to get up, to jump up and run, and to know he could not was to live a nightmare. He fought to call for Rock, but his voice was dry in his throat. Frantically, he twisted about, grabbed his crutches, and struggled to find a footing on the hill. But even as he somehow managed to rise, he stopped, swayed as if struck, and reached out a hand not to strike, but unbelieving to touch. She stood there at the margin of the grove, a pale face atop a mantle of shadows, her eyes wide and gleaming. But what he read in them he could not be sure, whether it was love or hate, pity, disgust, scorn, all of these or none. She saw him in all his weakness and shame, broken, halting upon his crutches, and what she thought he could not guess. Another moment, another fraction of a heartbeat, and he might have read the mystery of her gaze, fathomed the pools darker than the darkness that were her eyes so long lost to him, so dearly, so painfully remembered. But even as he reached out, her mantle became a flurry of motion. Even as he cried out her name, a great wind beat upon his face. A shadow passed over the moon, and when Rock, horrified, came running from the hut, he found Elof staring lost and empty-eyed at the distant skies. In a few curt words he told his friend what had happened. Rock could do nothing but shake his head.
It's beyond me, either of them. If you didn't but dream them both up.
No! It was more like awakening. This could be the dream. I would be to all the powers that were. Rock scratched his head and chuckled.
Sorry, I'm too real. Tell you what, though. I'll stand here a while with you, if you will, and scan the skies, though your eyes are sharper than mine. And I don't think she'll come back. Not tonight, I mean,
he added hastily.
But another night, for certain. And each time she's come closer. That's something, isn't it?
Elof scraped a crutch in the snow. Thanks for that comfort. I should accept it. I might, if she had not come so hard on Tapayao's warning. What did she mean? What was her purpose? And whose? Her own? Or Louhi's?
Who am I to say? But it's a question better pondered within doors over warm wine. Or better yet, slept on. Will you not to your bed?
Elof resisted, but soon let Rock draw him away. But ever and anon he looked about him as he made their way down into the hollow where the forge stood, spilling golden warmth across the snow from its open door. As they turned the corner towards it, Elof cast one lingering look back, and stopped dead, though his crutches sank deep into the snow.
What is it?
Rock whispered.
Do you see her again?
No, whispered Elof. Do you look there?
What then? The slope, the water, the further shore, snow upon snow, and the first clear night we've had for an age and an age.
Clear it is. Clear as glass and as brittle. Look up, man. Up. To the shore. The hills. The far horizon. There the night is not clear. A fell word is written on it. Have you the eyes to see? Rock saw and caught his breath in anguish. For the sight he also knew too well, and too many memories came flooding back. More than the light of moon or star picked out the peaks of the most distant hills. Faint and tenuous though it was, there was no mistaking it. Like the light of some distant lake, impossibly still, the radiance of the ice flew across the night, and in it, through it, the lights of the aurora danced and flickered.
But it's hardly closer than it was,
exclaimed Rock.
Still far too far for any direct assault, whatever Tapayao told you.
There are other ways of being close. Perhaps he sensed Kara's presence, for something of the ice must cling to her. Or did he mean... Rock, what wind has chased the clouds so swiftly?
Why, bloody north wind. Can't you feel it? Straight off the ice.
Yes. All along the horizon, so the ice can shine out clear, like a signal or a banner. Rock shrugged dismissively.
As far off as this? It'll not daunt us.
Aye, But is it for us? How will it look close to? Remember what Kermorven and I told you of? On the glacier? Rock whistled.
As if the sky'd frozen and the stars come down to dance. A fine rallying for the forces of the ice.
Elof nodded. That assault I foresaw. I'll wager it's that. It would make sense. To have it 2 years in the brewing, building up their forces, and these raids a mere sham of Lohi's devising, to keep them well-blooded but preserve their strength.
And wear down Nithades,
muttered Rock.
We'll have to warn him.
How far will he credit me after I warned him last? Hell, they won't even be able to see that display from the mainland. They're too low. A few lights in the sky and words in my head? You know what he'll make of that.
Whatever he does, we've got to try.
Elof frowned. Yes, but there's little we can do till daylight. None save Nithade himself, or one or two of the guards, would come near Elan Gorenhayan by night.
Not even if we fired the whole forge, growled Rock. And they're all up at the palace. So be it, since it must. At first light, and may it be in time.
But there was no need. If it should seem strange that the chroniclers count that one night's happenings as crucial, then let it be remembered that the weightiest of balances turn on the finest of points. It is known that, even as Elof and Rock spoke, lights danced in the sky over Karis, as over the wildlands. Angry sparks of red and gold. The beacon fires sprang from hill to hill like the first sparks of a racing forest fire, and after them the golden flashes of the signal mirrors. Even as Elof flashed a mirror towards the guard post on the harbor wall, royal messengers were spurring their lathered mounts across the slippery cobbles around the harbor, and ere he had sent his warning, he saw beyond the walls the masts of the tall cogs stirring as they were warped from dock to loading quay, ready to re-embark the troops they had but lately released to homes and families. The assault had already begun. More word soon followed. The first assault had spent itself among the maze of Elof's defenses, with terrible slaughter done by the light garrison. But they themselves had taken great losses, and feared another such attack would leave them unable to man the wall. There were signs that one was mustering, greater than the first, but strange beasts prowled the lands around, and terrors stranger still, and trackers and spies who sought to discover more did not return. Nithade was needed, and that very afternoon he set sail with such force as he could gather from the city, leaving his commanders to raise levies from the other lands and follow. Elof and Rock were watching from the vantage of the forge as the flotilla departed, but they were surprised to see the king's cog drop anchor in the lee of Elan Gorenhayan, and Nithade himself be rowed ashore. His greeting was unceremonious. "What's this about a warning of yours?" he was bellowing before his boat scraped onto the shore. "How do you come to know something was afoot?" Elof told him only of the lights over the ice, making no mention of Tapayao or Kara, and he tugged angrily at his beard. "It looks bad," he muttered, "and you can't tell me more. No more cunning tricks to hand." Elof studied the king a moment. His heavy face seemed to have loosened, coarsened. He had grown fatter, and there were dark pouches under his eyes, stale wine on his breath. I have nothing ready to show you, king. Disappointment and desperation chased like clouds across Nethade's face, and the veins at his temple bulged. Nothing, he barked. Then, and with a glance at the men in the boat, he lowered his voice. Nothing at all. What have you been about these past weeks, then? What do you think I treat you this well for? You're still a thrall by Varia, and you'll serve as one. Or you needn't the lash to remind you. I do have a work in hand, Elof answered truthfully, which may be of great service against the ice, but it is not yet finished. Then finish it, man. Finish it today, while I watch. King, if I could, I would. Believe you me. But you should know by now that smithcraft cannot be hurried. It will take some weeks still. But when it is done, I promise, the first to see and wonder will be you. If I'm still here, muttered Nethade, and then added, if I'm not, you are answerable to my sons, remember. The throne will be there soon in any event. I grow old. I can stand little more of this. He drew a deep breath, then straightened up and turned on his heel, and stalked back to the boat. Over his shoulder he shouted back, I'll have it the moment I return, mind ya.
There goes a man afraid,
observed Rock thoughtfully as they watched the king rowed back to his ship. Looking for some straw to clutch.
Now he'll be telling the rowers he's had counsel from the sorcerer, so they can spread the rumor to hearten his troops.
And so he can blame everything that goes amiss upon me, said Elof with a grim smile. Well, to work. I've a promise to keep now. At least it will be many weeks more till we are disturbed again. In that, as it turned out, he was wrong. It was only some 3 weeks later that Rock's cry brought Elof hurrying and stumbling up from the depths of the forge. The light hammers and shapers he had been using spilling from the pockets of his forge leather. He leaned on the window ledge and squinted into the bright morning sun. You're right, he said in some surprise. A royal barge, painted like a jaybird, and flying the sun emblem. But Nethade never uses such a thing to come see us. He and Rock looked at each other.
Someone more fond of pomp and luxury. I'll wager it's them.
No stake, said Elof dryly. I can see them, and it's here they're headed.
Then do you go clean up and don a robe. Something ceremonial. The more maidsmith these two see, and the less thrall, the better.
Elof nodded thoughtfully. When a horn sounded a flourish from the hill outside, it was Rock who swung open the heavy door of the forge. Elof smiled to himself as he heard the flourish falter. Someone was evidently nervous at finding himself there. The two tall figures who stepped over the threshold, however, could hardly have radiated a more arrogant confidence in their manner and their rich dress, scarlets and greens. It might only have been interest that had caused them to hesitate before the great sun symbol upon the door, or the dimness within. Elof had closed the shutters and plied the bellows to the forge fire by whose hearth he now sat. He had donned a robe Nethade had given him, and which normally he hated. It was of smith's black, full about the sleeves and hood, worked about breast and cuffs with symbols of smithcraft in gold, and he suspected it had belonged to Emilus. but now it served his purpose admirably. He had pulled the hood over his face, and as he rose from the hearthside, he felt he looked every inch the sorcerer. The crutches he could not help, but to offset them he held, as if ceremonial, a huge, long-shafted hammer. The sight of him, shadowed against the head-high forge flames, stopped the princes in their tracks. "Hail, my lords!" he said, and his voice rang beneath the high rafters of the forge. "You honor the Isle of the Sorcerers with your presence. How fares the king, your father, in his wars? Does he send word by you?" Behind the princes, he saw Rock striving not to laugh. He evidently thought Elof was simply out to keep those young popinjays off balance. But Elof's purpose was more serious, and he pressed it home. Were these the new lords of Caris he spoke to? The thought that Nithade might be dead flamed agony in his heart. "Do you set foot here today by his command?" The older one, Gerida, was that his name? Looked Elof up and down with elaborate unconcern, and then turned to a workbench and idly picked up an elaborate piece of goldwork, a gem setting in fine wire. "Quite cunning," he remarked. "I see now why he trusts you with so much gold. But then, you have shown yourself worthy of trust, have you not? Many and oft a time, and yet you have reason to hate him. Is this not so, Master Valent?" "I have never pretended otherwise, Prince." Gerda rounded on him sharply, taken aback by this casual mode of address. But he held back his words, and stood stroking his curling black beard, though something burned still in his eyes. "You hate a man, yet serve him faithfully." He looked around. "And for a poor reward, it seems to me. Eh, Kenrick?" The younger prince chuckled. "I wouldn't kennel my hounds in such a hovel as this. You're a puzzle, sorcerer. Gold flows through your hands, yet it seems that little sticks. I think our respected father has been rather unfair." "Quite so," mused Gerda. "I think that such service deserves its proper reward. You know that he has left the kingdom to us jointly, Master Valent. Well, if my brother is agreeable, I think we can do better. We can certainly do better for you than this." Kenrick chuckled. "Of course. We'll set you free, sorcerer. How about that, huh?" "At the very least," said Gerda emphatically, gazing a little reproachfully at his brother. "Freedom alone is small repayment. In the old days, a king would have ennobled a smith for that armour alone. I think a barony might be in order. A titular one, of course, with a stipend instead of a land, to free you from responsibilities, to allow you to remain with us at court and practice your art there." Kenrick chuckled. "Say then, would you not rather serve a better master, one who rewarded you more to your liking?" Gerda stiffened, and his dark eyes flashed a sudden anger at his brother. Elof read in it a warning. If it were possible to have them talk more freely, they would have to believe they were on safe ground for that. He bowed his head slowly and laid down the hammer. "I have done so in the past. Gladly would I do so once more." The two men visibly relaxed, and Kenrick smiled mockingly at his brother. "You will serve us then, sorcerer." "That may be," said Elof cautiously, "when your father wills it." "Yes," chuckled Kenrick, "and willed it he has. For his last testament is made and witnessed. Elof bit his lip. Do you tell me he is dead, then? Cannot your dark arts reveal the truth of that? Inquired Gerda sarcastically. What if he is? What indeed? Said Elof calmly, and shrugged. That, if I mistake not, you will tell me. Kenrick glanced nervously about him. Send your man away. This is not for the ears of thralls. Elof, smiling inwardly, glanced at Gerda, but saw only fierce and wary attention. Well and good. For all their scorn, they had soon forgotten that he also was a thrall. Imperiously, he waved Rock outside. Rock tugged his forelock and altogether overdid his show of deference, mopping and mowing. Fortunately, neither prince paid him the least attention. Their eyes were fixed on Elof. On Kenrick's smooth brows, beads of sweat had sprung out. He sought to speak, but his voice had dried up to a hoarse croak. Gerda's eyes narrowed, and he tossed the gold work into the air and caught it deftly. He was a burly man like his father, but taller and leaner, and at some 24 years a far more impressive figure. Save in the eyes. His were narrowed, and without Nithade's glittering vitality. Under his will, we inherit you with all else. We may do with you as we will, sorcerer. You would not wish to displease us, I am sure, but I need say no more than that. He smiled suddenly, a handsome, engaging smile. You see, it is not my way to govern with threats, or my noble brothers. We are not, shall we say, so single-minded as our father. We would not spill blood needlessly, nor dice with the lives of men. We believe in justice and peace. I would be glad to see such a one king of this land, said Elof smoothly. You will work your wizardly for us, then, Mr. Vallant, broke in Kenrick impatiently. His brother hissed wordlessly between clenched teeth, and he added, I mean, since it is willed so, aid us, and you'll find us generous. Gerda gestured him angrily to silence. This sorcerer is a wise man. I'll avow that he and I understand one another. He'll serve us far more willingly than ever he has Nithade. He paused a moment, tugging at his beard with an air of deep reflection, and met his brother's eyes a moment before adding, When the time comes, of course. No, sorcerer, it is not yet here. Our father still lives. Word has reached us that he has beaten back the worst the Ice Witch could do, at a great cost in lives, and there is talk of peace. He stays only to be sure her forces have all drawn back. Soon he will return and take up his throne again. For years and years, maybe, spat out Kenrick, a frustration in his voice that sounded close to tears. He was shorter than his brother, and though little more than a year younger, the plumpness he kept gave him a boyish look, which his trim moustache only served to accentuate. You couldn't ask for better, could you, Smith? Years more swinking under his thumb and this place. Years before you can come into our service. He gazed moodily into the fire. No more could we. Years of guzzling mouths, of endless levees, of eating, sleeping, breathing nothing but war. Of shedding a great river's worth of blood, put in Gerda, Terrible, of course, but absolutely necessary, you understand?
Oh, of course, complained Kenrick, sprawling back on a bench. To win back all those wild wastelands on our northern borders, absolutely. Why should it matter, after all, that they've not been ours for 2 generations past, and that we've never missed them? Or the gate, that had become a punishment posting for mutinous soldiers. So far was it from anything anywhere civilized. Let the savages have them. That's what some people might say. Give up chasing about after every flea bite of a raid. After all, those border folk are half savage anyway. Leave them to fight one another and the rest of the country in peace. That's what some folks might say, but never us. He snorted. We're with our father, every step of the way. We can't wait to go blundering about the backwoods with a huge force every time the savages lift a few cows from the peasants. So we stir them up and have to spend another fortune quelling 'em. Eh, Gerada? Can we? We're afraid the ice witch is going to come and get us.
Gerda smiled thinly, like a kindly adult entering into the spirit of an infant's game. I lie awake, worrying about it, he remarked. Never mind that I've never seen the ice moving any nearer in my lifetime. Our father is quite right to encourage all that cloud of superstition about it. And this witch woman that savages worship, how else would he drum up so much support?
How else indeed? Laughed Kenrick.
His brother seemed content to let him run on, as if confident what opinion of him Elof would form.
After all, if it isn't the ice he has to deal with, it's those border lordlings. Now, there are those might be content. Let them run free and be hanged if they like, with their endless provincial bickerings, not as if they brought in their worth and taxes after all. But no, let's butcher every savage and whip every lordling into line, I, and beggar the kingdom for century to come, if we need to.
He bit off what he had been about to add and spat viciously into the fire. Gerida, who had been looking wary, relaxed and nodded calmly. Our esteemed father is certainly a man of great and warlike ambitions. If he makes peace with the savages, he will turn next to uniting our borders. That will be a bloody business, yet already he talks of it. And then, why, he dreams of the lands across the sea, whence I believe you came. Naturally, you would wish to see him rule there also. There is no limit to his ambition. And, of course, the prince shrugged, he is fully entitled to it. He is, after all, the king. But there is no treason, after all, in favouring, as we have on occasions counselled, a less dedicated approach, suggested Elof, resting heavily on his crutches. The rumour of peace had shaken him, and he could think of little else at that moment. I see you understand, but, as he is entitled to do, he has ignored that. These things cannot be helped, of course. Our father is the rightful king, and we his loyal sons. There are those, of course, even many great lords and men of wealth and influence, who feel that our father's rule grows daily too costly, and not only in money, that he throws away lives like so much wine lees. They complain, if you will credit it, that they are weary of glutting this strife with their taxes and their sons. But this is dangerous talk of rebellion even, and there has been far too much of it around the court of late. We have done our best to suppress it, of course, but these things are particularly hard to contain. especially while the king is away. You take my meaning?" "Of course," said Elof, with a slight bow. Having endured Nithade's doting upon these his own flesh, he felt an almost physical surge of sickness. He had seen without difficulty the way they were leading, and without surprise. But to hear this monstrous ingratitude from their own lips was almost beyond bearing. "We are particularly afraid that some such foolish rebellion might be prepared to strike before he could return. In such a time, we must move with circumspection. A personage such as yourself could be of material importance in assuring the success or failure of such a revolt. If, for example, you were preparing some powerful engine of war for Nithade on his return, as it is rumoured, you might be approached or even abducted by such rebels." "Tortured even," Kenrick chimed in. "They'll balk at nothing, men like that." Gerda nodded, tugging his beard. "It is possible. I do not like the idea, but it is possible, when the stakes are so great. We came to warn you, therefore, and to assure ourselves of exactly where your loyalties might stand in this matter, were you approached, pressured even, by any such misguided faction." He paused, expectantly. "You may be sure," said Elof slowly, "that my loyalties are engaged as you would wish them to be, and that if the worst should come to the worst, I would hope to serve you and your brother in exactly the same manner as your father. As it happens—" He leaned on his crutches and steepled his fingers, watching the sudden flaring of interest in their faces. "As it happens, I am indeed working on such a device, which could be of signal advantage to either side in any rising, if they were clever enough and enjoyed sufficient support. I would feel a great deal better if you knew about it." "And perhaps took charge of it?" suggested Kenrick. His brother glared at him. "Some details, at least, might be of assistance. A demonstration, even, if you are not saving that for Nithade." Elof smiled. "For him, yes. But in the circumstances, I consider this more important. Provided all this is kept in the utmost confidence." He looked at Kenrick, and then meaningly at Gerda. "That goes without saying," said the older prince sharply, with a sour look at his brother. "Then I will be pleased to show you what I am working on, when it is ready." The two keen faces clouded with impatience and disappointment. "Why not now?" demanded Kenrick. "At least give us some idea. If we are to forestall any such treacherous action," put in Gerda quietly, "we must have some sight of it before he returns." "Till it is ready, there is nothing to demonstrate," said Elof firmly, thinking of the shimmering beauty that hung concealed in the cooling furnace below. "How long will that be, think you?" "No more than 3 weeks away, I'd guess." "Well, can you achieve it in that time, sorcerer?" That the tone was a threat in itself, but Elof smiled as if he had not heard it. "I believe I can," he said. "I must consider and study. If I may send word to you, no later than 14 days hence. By my thrall, he is to be trusted entirely," he added, as their faces darkened. He watched greed war with caution in them both, as clearly as metals that cannot alloy. At length, Gerda nodded. "Very well, but take care. The conspirators may be all around you. Why, we have not even dared warn our father yet. So certainly would any such message be intercepted and the rebels alerted. There is no need to bother him for now." Elof smiled broadly and bowed. "You need have no fear. I will turn aside in this matter. What more could I wish, after all, than to enjoy the gratitude of the heirs apparent and the just reward of my toil? I would wish you no less, my princes." Kenrick chuckled. "When our father returns, we will see to it that you have your reward. Whatever a cunning sorcerer takes delight in, eh?" He chuckled and clucked his tongue lightly. "Whatever your desires, whatever your tastes, set yourself no bounds. You may indulge them all." His mustache worked as his mouth pursed at the thought. Gerda shook his head reprovingly. "This learned and cunning man would scarcely bother with such things," he said with calm certainty. "Come, brother, let us take our leave ere ye offend him farther. We await your word, sir, and leave our lives and the good of this poor, bleeding realm in your hands. Come, Kenrick." Elof bowed deeply as the tall young man turned his brother towards the door. Kenrick acknowledged him with a jaunty and patronizing wave. But Gerda studied him a moment out of his narrowed eyes, and then inclined his own head slightly. Elof watched them step through the door and out onto the hill, and was about to sink down in his seat when Gerda plunged back inside and strode over to him. "My gloves," he remarked, somewhat loudly. "I must have laid them down somewhere. Ah, there." They lay on the bench beside Elof. As Gerda bent over to pick them up, he paused and murmured, "Hearken to me, wise man. You heard my brother prattle. You will have formed your own view of his discretion. He is scarcely to be trusted. I counsel you, when you send that word, do you send it to me alone?" Kenrick poked his head around the door. "What keeps you, brother?" "I had left my gloves, and I was remarking that I wish to command an armour also, when times are more settled." "No, sir sorcerer," laughed the younger brother. "Do you shape me one first, for he hardly cares to bestride a horse this one, let alone fight with his own two hands. He'd sooner crouch over the coals and plot." Gerda ushered him firmly out, and Elof slumped down and rested his head in his hands. When Rock reappeared, having seen their boat safely away, he looked up at him. "Pour me a stoup of wine, will you? A foul flavor needs rinsing from my mouth." He tossed back the cup at a gulp. Rock refilled it, and Elof nodded his thanks. "When I think how the king has doted on these two young vipers, how that old brute has driven himself half into his grave these past years, killing himself with the effort to leave them a kingdom secure, united, and at peace." Elof shook his head furiously. I could almost find it in me to pity the man.
"As he raised his seed, so he must reap it,"
said Rock censoriously.
"It might be a hard and scarring thing to be raised by such a man. I'll wager his devotion could make twice a tyrant of him, and crush those it fell on.
Elof nodded. Crushed they are, out of their natural shape.
You don't know the half of it, grunted Rock. That little swine Kennerek. As we're turning down to the boat, he makes as if to toss me a coin, and stands fumbling in his purse. Well, I'm playing the daft mechanical, so I stand and wait, and damned if he don't whisper to me that I'm to warn you his brother will betray and cheat you as he's cheating him. And you're to send the word to him alone, or failing that I'm to bring it to him anyhow, and he gives me a gold piece, no less, as an earnest.
Rock tossed it on the table.
Another of yours, damn it!
They laughed, but Elof swiftly grew serious. I wonder if Kenrick is quite the fool his brother thinks him. Gerda did not think to bribe you, which might have been the surer way of getting the message, had you been the usual thrall. Though he did contrive to assure me he would still have a use for me afterwards, with the mention of armor. Rock poured more wine.
There's not a hand's breadth between them. Hella have the pair of them for me.
He looked anxiously at Elof.
Not really gonna aid them, are you? Not even for revenge on Nithade?
And give Karis to the ice? Hardly. I could simply betray them to Nithade. For what revenge could be keener than showing him the treachery of what he loves the most? His own flesh and blood. Elof considered. But I do not seek so base a vengeance. And as they warned me, I might not manage it. Yet. He sipped absently at his wine. There is too much that does not satisfy me, Rock. Too much I fail to understand. This talk of peace with the ice. What in the world could induce Lohi to offer that?
Maybe the hiding Karis has given her. You suggested that once. Made her think she'd be better off turning her powers elsewhere. Against Morvenhall, maybe as we feared.
It might be, and yet I cannot believe it. Nithade has only just held back the Ekwesh, and they are no more than the advance guard of the ice. There is none of that unity of heart and mind here that the ice seems to fear, as witness those two. They endanger the land, and something more worried me.
So it bloody well should. Bugger the land. What about you and me? Can't you see? They fear what you've shown you can do. If you don't help them, they've as good as threatened to slay you, just to deny their father your help.
I know, said Elof calmly. I meant something else. Something lurking under their whole approach to us. They spoke as they did, so that no word could be reported. In another's voice, the true meaning would be lost. Yet would you have babbled out so perilous a plot so lightly to one you hardly knew? However badly you needed his help? However sure you were he hated your victim? They seemed in such haste, too hasty to make caution worthwhile for them. He paused. Or for me. As if they knew something might happen to me.
Or they planned it to,
muttered Rock.
The treacherous little swine's heads.
Then he brightened again.
But you must still be all right for those 2 weeks, or they wouldn't have swallowed the weight. And after that...
After that, we'll see. I will deal with them another way. But we must hasten our plans, Rock. At least I've one time to work without interruption. Still. But in that, as before, he was mistaken. The days that followed were a time of unrelenting toil. They had known many such in their lives, but seldom, if ever, had they had so clear and steep a brink marked out before them, or so dark an abyss beyond. They knew their span. In 14 days they must be ready, for after that might lie ruin for themselves, and so, perhaps, all that they cared for in the world. Their work began before the sun, and finished after it, though it was high summer and the evenings growing long. Through light and dark they labored, and sought rest only when they were close to falling, when the arm would no longer support the weights it must, when the fingers trembled perilously over delicate work, and the details of it became dull blurs under aching, smoke-ridden eyes. Once in a while rest was forced upon them, chiefly when the furnace must be left to cool. But Elof grudged the rest even as he welcomed it. For him, sleep became a monster that drew him down unwilling into shadowy deeps, into nightmare and turmoil that left him feeling almost worse when he awakened. Rock slept better, but all his food smacked of little save smoke and soot. Late one evening, that of the 12th day since the coming of the princes, such an enforced rest found Elof slumped upon the hearth-side seat where his aching limbs and shoulders could draw in the milder warmth gratefully, taking bread and drink he could hardly taste. His eyes burned from the endless intricacies of his task. The urge to haste burned in his veins, and with it the fear that all might come to a crux too soon. He felt a fierce restlessness, and the need to distract his racing mind. It was a jeweler's craft he exercised here, yet the power in it was vast, and must be tightly secured, firmly controlled, lest the work shatter under its own stress. So also it was with him. Rock was throwing open doors and windows to clear the manifold smells and smokes of the labors, and let the scent of the myrtle bushes nearby drift in on the warm airs, alive with the creaking of the cicadas. But at the window that looked down to the river he stopped, gaped, and swore horribly. "What is it?" Elof shouted.
"There's a bloody boat down there, beached and all, sail furled, and a couple of sailors dozing in her lee. Someone sneaked ashore."
"But who? Is it the royal barge?"
"No, half the size, but it looks rich enough."
Elof swung round on his crutches, but even as he did so he saw the shadow that crossed the doorway. He raised his voice in an impressive challenge.
"Who comes unheralded to the Sorcerer's Isle?"
The voice that answered him was a woman's, hard and clear and proud. "No herald needs a Princess Bethel to any servant of the king, her father." "Bow down to receive her." Through the doorway stepped two tall and haughty women, angular in rich-hued gowns of court, and stood flanking the entrance, their eyes flickering nervously about the strangeness of the forge. After a moment, seeing no lurking peril, they turned and bowed, and between them stepped a shape shorter and more shapely of a girl of at most 20 years, probably a shade less, startlingly pretty, clad in a divided hunting gown of green as bright as her eyes, with breeches of the same beneath. She hesitated only a moment before she saw Elof, standing stunned behind a great anvil, and advanced to meet him. Her body, slender and lithesome, moved with a skipping grace that set her mane of long chestnut hair asway. That, and the hair alone, allowed Elof to recognize in her the little girl of 11 who had witnessed his downfall and disgrace. And now, of all things, she was holding her hand out to be kissed. "I seek the master smith," she said in a soft voice, slightly tremulous, as speechless with astonishment. He took it in his lips. "The crippled one, the valiant, the sorcerer." Elof placed his hands at the open neck of his shirt, upon the small stamp that hung there. "I am the master smith, my lady, Elof Valantor. You will find no sorcerers here." And he bowed as best he could on his crutches. She made no reply at first, but stared at him wide-eyed, her feelings coursing undisguised across her face. There was fright at first, and surprise. She stepped back a little, and her hand flew to her throat. Then came awe and sudden interest, and she looked him up and down with a heedless arrogance that made him acutely aware of his maimed legs. "But you're so much younger than I thought to find," she said. Then her eyes grew apprehensive again. "Or is that only the way you chose to look?" "I am as you see me, my lady," he answered, a little stiffly. She had looked on him last with the eyes of a child, 8 years since, and though even now he was not yet in his middle years, she had evidently been expecting some snaggle-toothed spellmonger out of romances. Perhaps her brothers had been telling tales and exaggerating the mysterious figure he cut. "Of course," she laughed, a little too blithely. "Why, you might almost be handsome if you kept yourself cleaner, and if you could manage to smile now and again. Or are you so set in grime and grimness that your cheeks would crack?" "You come upon me in the practice of my craft and mystery, my lady. At the day's end you would find me scrubbed as clean as you could wish to look upon. And should I, in my plight, smile as lightly as any careless mayfly of your father's court? I saw you weep once at a certain sight." She laughed again, and wrinkled her dainty nose. "Oh, I was only a child when last you saw me. Father would not let me come here in all these years." "Then should you have come now, my lady? Will your father not be wroth with you? If you go swiftly, he need never find out." She arched her brows at him. "So eager to be rid of me? Do you have so many high-born ladies visit you that you must drive one forth ere the next arrive?" Elof smiled wryly and bowed again. "Doubtless they would all pale away before your fair presence, my Lady Bethel. I spoke only out of concern for your gracious self." She laughed and clapped her hands. "Ah, so you can smile when you wish, I see. And play the courtier also. But my father is far off, deep in endless wrangles with the barbarians or some treacherous lord, I know not which, and besides, he grows old. He will hardly care about such a petty thing, not now." She checked at a thought, and began to rummage in the long and heavy sleeves of her outer robe. "Not now my brothers have set foot here, I meant. But still, I have no time to waste. There's dancing tonight in the hall. I came not out of vulgar curiosity. I wish ye to mend something for me. A god, an ornament. Ah, here it is." And before Elof's appalled eyes, she cast the two halves of the golden arm ring, chiming upon the anvil beside him. He stood staring at it, and felt the blood drain from his face. "Is aught amiss?" he heard her ask, sudden concern in her tone. But her voice reached him as from some infinite distance. "Are you unwell? Or can it not be mended? Has it been resoldered too often? Speak freely, ye need not fear my displeasure. It is the least of my things, but I have had it since I was a child, and am grown fond of it. Only it is forever breaking, and my ladies insist I cannot wear a broken thing now I am no longer a child, and that I must give it up or have it made whole. Only," she added a little wistfully, "there is no goldsmith in the city who has ever been able to heal it neatly or lastingly, not without melting it down altogether, and I fear they would spoil it then." Elof drew breath and recovered his calm. He guessed there was more, that word had indeed got round of the prince's exploit. Probably Kenrick had been boasting of it, though hardly of his true reasons, save to a select few. Almost certainly she was not among those, but she had been delighted at having such an excuse for a slightly daring exploit of her own, of being able to boast that she too had bearded the mysterious sorcerer in his den, all the more because her father would not approve. "It can be remade well enough here," he told her, caressing the pieces with his fingertips, feeling the ridges of solder built up about the broken surfaces. He would gain little from lying about that. She would only take the pieces away to cherish. And so it should be. "But, my lady, do you know what you have brought me?" He chose his words carefully. "This God was made by me, and taken from me against my will, and the loss of it all but broke my heart. It was the first gift from me to my wife, who was lost to me." "Oh," breathed the young woman, and laid a light finger on one of the serpentine pieces, so that it rocked back and forth. "How sad that she is lost, sorcerer. But my father would have found you another if you had asked him, a very fair one, even though you're not a whole man." "I have never wished another," answered Elof as calmly as he could, still holding back from open appeal. Bethel looked at him more closely, and her green cat eyes grew softer. "That is sweet. You must have loved her very much. Make me the ring again, Valant, and maybe you will find another to love." Elof grew desperate, and clenched his hand on the anvil's rim. "Princess, I ask it of you. I beg you, do not keep it from me. If I could, I would throw myself at your feet for it. Give it me, and I will shape you such jewels as never blazed about the body of any princess on this earth. I will draw down the light of moon and stars and girdle you with them. I will crown you with the rays of the sun. I will make you a vision among the powers. But do not keep it from me." She was all astonished attention now, biting at her neat forefinger with unconscious childishness. "Could you do that indeed?" she whispered. "How soon? Would it take long?" "It could not be hurried, my lady," admitted Elof. "A year, perhaps, if my labors are as light as now. A brief time for such an end. My lady, give it to me." Sadly, regretfully, she shook her head. "Alas," she said softly, "it may not be. I would have you work your wonders, but soon." She checked herself once more. "But, Valant, I did not take the ring from you. It was given to me, and I love it. I cannot let it go for a promise. You may keep it a few days at least, to remake it. Do that, and make me these jewels you promise, and then, maybe, I'll let you ask it of me again, and I shall take good care of it in the meantime. Never fear." "My lady," cried Elof in anguish, "do not sport with love, as you hope for love yourself." Her neat mouth pursed, and she stamped hard on the earthen floor. "You presume upon my good heart, smith. What are you but a thrall? My father's broken bondsman, unfitted even to address me, let alone beg. All you have is mine by right. All the jewels you can make me mine, if I but wish them. It is not for you to bandy bargains with the princess of the Lonun. 5 days from now my father is due back. I shall return on the 3rd. If the ring is not made whole, then do you look to that wise head of yours, and seek not to gull me with substitutes. I have worn that ring these many years, and even remade I shall know it. Meanwhile, you may reflect on what respect is due a princess." She spun on her heel, waving her women away before her. The wide skirts of her gown flared about her. Her riding boots clattered on the threshold, and the door slammed. Elof bowed his head down over the anvil till his forehead almost touched the cold iron, and his fingers gripped the rim of it as if to dig deep into the metal. "Ugh." Rock breathed eventually, breaking the tense silence.
Old Nethade's losing his grip for sure, if even that chit and child rushes to defy him."
"No, Rock," said Elof. His voice was stern, though the grime on his face was streaked and moist. "There is more to it than that. I am sure now. She also was strangely in haste, and twice she all but let slip that time, my time, grows somehow short. That is why her dear brothers were in such haste then, and it all has some connection with Nethade's return." He hobbled laboriously to the window and watched the little boat pulling away from shore, the sail hoisting and swelling, shining suddenly scarlet as if the rays of sunset filled it. He could not see whether she was looking back at him. "It grows shorter than you dream of, lady, that time."
"But can you?"
demanded Rock.
"In 5 days, if it's true what you fear, can we finish our work in that time?"
"We must we not? And one thing more, even. This He caught up the halves of the ring, clutched them to him, and held them to his lips, his eyes, his breast. Whatever may befall, this shall be made anew. What means Elof used are not recorded. Most probably, he encased the two pieces together in the finest clay or sand, as the ring was first molded, and fired it with long and delicate care as it first was, in the upsurge of earth fires. He would have sung the same soft songs over the chrysalis within, which the sundered gold sweated, shivered, and at last grew liquid, as it seethed and flowed in currents of convected heat, pent within the shell of its own shape. But within that shell there would be nowhere it might flow, save into itself, uniting, mingling. Within that shell the process of change was brought to its absolute, only to be turned back upon itself. A dissolution so total it restored form, a turmoil so fierce it imposed unity, a storm that served only to create a greater calm. However this may be, there is no doubt that Elof succeeded, for as he gazed upon the ring remade, it is set down that he wished aloud he could do as much for himself. Melt myself down in my own furnace, mold myself anew, mended and whole, and in doing it I might even skim away the clinging dross of all my past, all my follies and my cruelties, all the wrongs I have done, all the wrongs done to me. I might forget them altogether. I could just escape then, and have done with it, this damnable hunger for revenge. Grow to hate it, Rock. Hate what I must do to glut it. It is a master almost crueler than Nithade. I hate to deal in this way, even with such as they.
What's this, then, from you of all folk? Mercy? Compassion?
Rock looked around from the bag he was packing, and his voice grew edged and bitter.
It's never yet held you back from what you thought needed doing. Didn't stay you with poor old Inger, did it? Or Corentin? Or Kara? Why then now, with these creatures that are 100 times the worse?
Elof writhed beneath the sting of the words, but he made neither protest nor denial, for they both knew too well there was none.
You've never scrupled to mess with your friends. Why balk at your foes? Regret's cheap when it comes too late, my lad. What you've planned now, you must do, or all's to rack and ruin. More, maybe, than you know. You'll not make yourself a better man by turning stupid.
No, muttered Elof, still burnishing at the gold, though it shone bright as it ever had in the midday sunlight. But it may yet make myself worse. Enough. High time you were on your way. The guard boat is waiting. And take care. Rock nodded curtly and turned to the door.
I'll do my part, never fear. Only do you yours.
The door closed behind him. Regretfully, Elof wrapped the bright, fair thing in a square of dark velvet and laid it aside on one of the benches beneath the window. He leaned there for a moment, resting his weary shoulders, and watched the guard boat with Rock on board pull away across the great smooth flood of the sunlit Yscanis. It was the last piece he could move, in a play that stood either to lure his foes into the check he had laid with such care, or to rebound upon him so utterly as to sweep him from the board. And Rock with him, perhaps, and many more. Had he been overbold? Too late if he had. He should be thinking of his work. They had loaded the furnace earlier. High time he shut it down. He limped over to it and began to spin the wheel back. Beneath him he felt the door grind across, though it seemed to be growing harder than usual to move. When it was 3/4 closed, it began to stick. He cursed, tugged at the wheel, wound it back, then sharp forward. It turned a little further, then stuck. Alarmed, he had to jerk it again and again, throwing all his weight upon the wheel till it seemed to clear the obstruction. At last it slid a little way smoothly, then a sharp clang told him the door was shut. He cranked the air vents open wider, knocked free the bolts on the outer door, and heaved it up, ducking back to let the gush of searing air disperse. Then it was only a matter of more waiting, until the stalks had spread their leaves wide enough to show him it was safe to enter. Waiting, and he could not even pace up and down. With rags wrapped around hands and feet, he swung himself down onto the stairs and shone his lamp into the mephitic gloom, coughing as the fumes caught his throat. The floor seemed different somehow. Its slope changed and less regular. He limped down the steps, though the rags were charring, and saw that at the rear by the door's foot the floor was no longer a smooth incline, but had across its center an irregular tongue of smoking slag. Small wonder he had had to fight that door shut. Whatever the reason, the earth fires were certainly growing fiercer. Now, from out of whatever vein lay open behind that door, they had come boiling up into the furnace itself. The sight filled him with horror. His labor, his creation, his last gate to freedom, all depended on the furnace. His very life, even if his play went as he planned, it was no longer safe to use. Yet, safe or not, he must open it again, if he still could, and risk unleashing what dire consequences he might. Suddenly, he became aware of the smoke arising around him. His rags were smoldering, and one trailing strip burst into a little yellow flame, easily stamped out, only he couldn't. He cursed and swung himself up the stairs, but that took time, and the rags were well alight as he emerged. He had the sense to smother them in sand first, rather than pour water over them, which would have carried the heat through too swiftly. Angrily, he peeled off the scorched cloths and slumped down with his back to an open window. He must think, and fast. On reflection, he decided, it could have been worse. It must have taken time to rise, that flood. It could only have happened moments before he shut the door. So it would again, most probably. He should be able to work in short bursts, ever watchful for what might be rising beneath. It would slow him, perhaps too much, yet there was no help for that. He would have to work all the faster now. Thoughts of what that would mean, problems present and foreseen, whirled and tangled in his mind. And though the forge and its engines stood quiet now, the creak and tick of contracting metal, the wind in the air vents, and the flow of water in the troughs were so loud that he did not hear the hull that ground onto the beach, the footsteps on the grassy slope, till they touched the very sill of the open door. He sat up in sharp surprise. Upon his threshold stood Bethael alone. She was clad now in a light silken gown of a leafy pattern, girdled with silver. The low sun behind it made a willowy silhouette of her body. She seemed tentative, almost shy in her manner, but she stiffened as she saw him. He bowed to her from where he sat. "Good evening to you, lady. I expected you tomorrow. You return earlier than you said." A haughty smile quirked her lips. "Why should I not? It is up to me. You've had ample time in any case." "Well, is it done?" Elof bent to gather up his crutches and did not reply. "Well," she shrilled and stamped her foot. "Have you mended it as I bade?" Then the arm ring caught her eye, gleaming on the velvet like the sun over storm cloud. "Oh," she said flatly. "You have?" She sniffed contemptuously. "I see you know how to obey your betters after all, like a good thrall." To Elof's acute ear, the tinge in her voice was almost clear enough to be called disappointment. She stalked over to the ring and was about to take it when Elof's hard hand closed over the shining gold. "Lady," he said quietly, "I have made that fair thing whole again, but I never said it was for you." "How dare you!" she squealed and stamped again. "Lady, that arm ring is not for you. There is a potency in it, a strong one. Its virtue a binding bond. It cannot create one where none exists, but where one is, it may act upon it, lend it strength. In what ways? Who can tell?" She snatched at the gold unheeding, but he did not release his grip. "Lady, I warn you only for your own sake." "Give it to me," she said, her front teeth white against her carmined lips, "and have done with your conjurer's cant. Have I not worn that ring all these years? Do you think I am still a child, to be frightened with tricks and shadows?" She shook the ring in Elof's grasp, and though she had none of Kara's strength, the memory defeated him, and he let it slip through his fingers. He caught earnestly at her arm, preventing her donning it. "Lady, upon your head be what follows if you take that ring to yourself." "Get away from me!" she cried, springing free and forcing the ring onto her arm. "Thralls have died in torture for less gross offences. Ah, you soil me! You stink of sweat and soot!" Elof sighed. He would achieve little by offending her, in her nostrils least of all. "Lady, I apologize. I was about to wash when you arrived." Doffing his sweat-stained tunic, he turned to the trough that flowed through the forge, reached for the bag of fatted lye hung beside it, and quickly splashed the cold spring waters about himself. He was half afraid she would simply march out on him, but knew she was still standing there. He could almost sense the intentness of her. Upon the ring? Then he heard her say, sardonically, "That is a fine crop of scars you bear, thrall. One might almost take you for a warrior, or an adventurer, rather than a sorcerer and an artisan." He laughed and tasted the bitterness on his lips. "I have been both, at need," he said without turning. "Once. I have crossed a whole wide land, and sought out the Duergar in their mountain fastness, and lived with them 2 long years. I have lived with the Alvar of the forests, Tapaiau's children, and escaped the forest's power. I have sailed the seas of the sunrise. I have fought beside an exiled lord against the Equesh by land and sea, and when he won himself his kingdom, I have battled the dragon beneath the earth, and the Ice Witch herself on a palace stair. Aye, and bested her. And yet I would far sooner be a man whole and at peace, in the land I made my own, with my true love by my side. He heard her laugh. A braggart as well as a bore. Elof turned about in annoyance and heard her gasp. She reached out suddenly, and he felt her soft fingertip trace out the faint mark on his breast. That is a scar also. That is the same scar as at the back. Your father remarked on that wound once, shortly before he had me crippled, before he made me a pinioned swan, a tethered hawk, less than a man. He turned away impatiently, and again she caught her breath. I see another pair, even more faint, but one such wound would have been mortal. How did you come by them? How survive them? Ask rather, why? He said, and went on washing. Behind him there was silence, until a small voice said, Would you tell me some of your adventures? Slowly he rose and turned, reaching for a cloth to dry himself. To a well-wisher or a friend? I might. But what joy or profit can there be for a listener who does not care? To his astonishment, a hand was laid lightly on his arm. Did I say that I did not wish you well? I will listen gladly, if it pleases you. He looked down at her, and suddenly her hand seemed to sear him worse than the forge flame. It was long, long since a woman had touched him. His breath faltered and grew fast, and forgetting all he hoped to gain by patience, he crushed her hand beneath his own, hard against him. She stiffened, but made no attempt to pull away. He swallowed, and heard his breath whistle through flaring nostrils. Hesitantly, she lifted her free hand and laid it upon his breast. Your heart pounds like your hammer, she said, and giggled softly, her eyes lowered. He felt a taut smile settle on his lips. Does yours? Her grip tightened on his arm, and slowly, tentatively, she bore it to her side. Equally slowly, with deliberate malice, he stroked his fingers down her ribs to her waist, and then up again, to slide one by one across the curve of her breast, gently passing over the peaked taunt beneath the gown's silken lightness. He bent to whisper in her ear, It does, and stayed to kiss the lobe of it, the neck beneath, the satin cheek, and so, at last, her parted lips. She met the kiss fervently at first, a little clumsily. Then suddenly she squirmed, wrenched free, gasping. How dare you? She squealed. What are you? What have you done? What have you done to me? What spell have you? Elof shook his head. I have cast no spell upon you, lady, but you took one upon yourself. Will you be able to shed it so easily? It has power. Yet remember, there is none in it to create what is not already there. No, she shrieked, and plucked the ring violently from her arm. It tangled in her gown a moment, fell, and rolled against some sacking. But then she let out a despairing wail, hugged herself tight, and burst into hysterical sobbing. Elof reached out to her, cupped her face in his strong hands, and she did not resist. His thumbs wiped the tears from her cheeks and tilted her head back to meet his gaze. Her eyes looked into his, and now his hands plowed among her crisp hair, stroking her neck from behind her ears to the neck of her gown, tracing its edge around to the front. Her eyelids fluttered and her head relaxed, lulled back, as the topmost fastening parted under his deft fingers, and they met and caressed in the hollow of her throat. She clutched at his shoulder to steady herself as they swept back, parting another fastening, and so on down till they curved around her neat, small breasts and laid them bare. He clutched her close then, and kissed her breast to breast, and she did not pull away, but drank at him as if he were a spring. He felt her heart flutter, and a flutter of a different pace below her ribs, down the whole front of her body, as though it were a bird imprisoned behind those bars and beating to be free. Slowly, carefully, as her gown fell open and apart, his fingers tracked it about her and down to its source, tracing it tangled amid damp curls. Gown and girdle slid unheeded to the silver sand. Her forehead lay on his shoulder. Her shifting thighs imprisoned his fingers as they explored, and she clutched at him in her turn, tugging at his belt, pulling at his breeches. A wave of hesitancy welled up in him suddenly. All these long years he had half believed himself become less than a man, maimed in more than limb, and he feared to find it true. But as her long fingers discovered him, probed and plucked at him, spider light, his fears were fiercely overborne. He managed to croak a word in her ear, and together they swayed and stumbled towards his bed, her fingers playing about him still, her lips smearing his chest with their color like so many fresh wounds. He flung aside his crutches, and they toppled together among the coarse blankets. She raised her head to kiss his lips, his throat, his shoulders and armpits where the crutches galled them. He lifted himself on his arms. His lips touched her breasts and lingered, then swept down, drinking her in, a feaster after famine, till her back arched like a bow, and her fingers wrung in his thick hair. Then, with a single shuddering gasp that two throats shared, they writhed together like serpents and joined. There was no love in that unity, save its very intensity. Only a community of need drinking from a common source, clambering one upon the other to reach a common peak. So savage was that need that it knew no barrier, no obstacle. Even braced, Elof's legs were almost useless, but by strength of arm alone he bore up the girl like a leaf in a whirlwind. The single fire that burned between their thighs breathed and quickened in that wind, grew hotter, brighter, and at last swelled out in a searing globe to envelop them, the room, the world in a scalding burst of light, in which nothing existed save their shared flesh. Timeless, rigid they hung there, and then it passed, and the world rushed in on them again. They fell sweating among the blankets, their thighs still thrusting convulsively one against another, the spasms of fighters dying upon each other's blades. They gasped for breath, through lips that trembled and would not form words. But as the fires in Elof's heart were slaked, so it fell to embers and ash. A black mood settled upon him, in which all that had passed seemed to him little better than rape, and an ugly parody of what he had felt with Kara. Missing her was an acute ache in his heart. Bethael sensed something amiss, and sought to distract him with mumbled endearments and caresses. She was inexperienced, but not unknowing, and gradually, despite himself, the brush of her breasts against him, the play of her lips, brought a reviving warmth. He stifled his sense of loss beneath cold cynicism, telling himself it scarcely mattered, and he should enjoy himself while he had the chance. He had held back long enough. She giggled again as he caressed her, and she felt him revive, and then with the mischievous flicker in her eye, she laid her head in his lap. Tongue darting, he gasped, laughed, rolled his head, and saw the long shadow that stretched out across the forge, seething, shapeless, demonic. Saw beyond the open door the slender woman's shape that cast it, the cloak that billowed from her arms, the short mail skirt that was her only garb, the helm above it like the head of some great bird of prey. Beneath its eye slots, slanting, narrowed, bitter rage burned in the dark gleam of her gaze. A rage he saw echoed in the very stance of her, tensed as against a high wind, spear outstretched. Then Bethael saw her too, screamed and sprang back among the blankets. But Elof had all but forgotten her, save as a fragment of his shame. He sprang up, forgetful still, in hope of running to the door, but only managed to sprawl headlong upon the sanded floor. Half stumbling, half crawling towards the light, he reached out an arm to her, but it seemed to him he read words in those wide, dark eyes, heard her voice clear in his mind. "Now you have lost me forever." His arm fell. He could not face her, and bowed his head. The long shadow changed, as if the cloak swirled now from arms upraised, and suddenly a great wind scoured through the forge, lashing his face with blown sand. The light pulsed, then was clear, empty. Elof turned away, blinking gritty eyes, and sank down by the bedside. Bethael sprang up from the bedclothes and clutched his arm. "Sweetheart, who was that? Will she tell?" In a fury of loathing, Elof rounded on her, swinging his arm to lash out viciously. "Away, you riggish little viper! Get out, out, and leave me be! Get you to Hela, you empty she-whelp, and beg a heart of her that some better soul has lost." She shrank back with a squeal and began to wail, open-mouthed like an infant. Elof sank his head in his hands. "No, no, I am sorry. The fault is mine alone." He looked at her. "Mine alone. Only the folly is yours. You came here for no good purpose. Came to taunt and tease a tethered bear." "I came because I was sorry for you." Elof shook his head sadly. "No, princess. Not so, whatever you told yourself. True, you pitied this man you thought fair, for being alone and womanless, and since you do not understand love, you thought to dangle your charms like a toy before him. Why not? It would be an extraordinarily condescension from one of your rank. He should feel honored. You came alone, and when you had made sure he was alone, you thought to sport with him a little, assuage your own feelings, but escape unscathed, unstained, and laugh at his frustration. But such feelings are dangerous to play with, my lady, most of all one's own. You were tethered by them in your turn. They were the chains. Well, do I speak false? She had stopped crying almost at once. A look of blazing outrage crossed her face, but Elof held up his hand. Shall I tell you why I am so sure? Because if you had been truly sorry for me, you would not have sought to deceive me. You would not have kept from me what your father plans for me as soon as he returns. What it is that made me one of the few men you could safely indulge yourself with, because you thought that soon my mouth would be far away or stopped forever. But of course, you had to have me repair your precious arm ring first. Her mouth opened in a shriek of anger, the tantrum of a child humiliated. But then she saw his bleak eyes, and slowly she subsided, cowering among the bedclothes. Do not look at me so, she whimpered. Do not hurt me. Elof gazed down at her, unrelenting. What does Nithade intend? He means I switch. She offered him peace, complete peace, on one condition only. That he hand me over to her. She nodded frantically, clutching the blankets to her bare body. He didn't agree at first. He's been haggling. Now they say she has offered the gate back and all the wild lands, to leave Keris be and take her savages to another land. They say he is coming back to announce his decision. Aye, before I get to hear it. Yes, she breathed. So. She began to weep again, slowly, looking up at him in terror. He sighed deeply, and when he reached out a hand, she cowered, but it was only to stroke her shivering shoulder. I spoke too harshly, he said. There was some pity in you, though much else. I alone am to blame. I wish you no ill, Bethael, and none shall hear of this from me. Get you dressed and go. Leave me here with my own company. I deserve no other. So afraid was she that she sprang up and ran to the door, almost forgetting to gather up her gown as she passed. Once she looked back at Elof, still sitting by the bed, and at the arm ring, gleaming against the dusty sacking. But she made no move to take it. For a moment it was her shadow that filled the doorway. Then, still naked, she ducked out into the light and was gone. Early next morning Rock returned, staggering up the hill, apparently much the worse for a night's wine. But once within the door, beyond sight of the departing guard boat, he became alert, even elated, and thumped his fists exultantly on the great table.
That's it. All your errands discharged. Every message delivered. Say, have I not done you proud?
He stopped then, and peered at Elof, saw him seated at the other end of the table, toying absently with the ring.
What's the matter, then? Not want to hear? What have you been up to, then?
He circled the forge, peered into the furnace, and turned on Elof savagely.
Not your bloody labors, that's for sure. You've not done half of what was left you. And when every flaming minute counts. Man, what's amiss in your head? A fine damned trial you can be to a patient man, and at what a time! Want to toss away your own life and mine too? All because you've suddenly sprouted a tender shoot of conscience? And for a crew of bastards and betrayers who merit it less than most I can set a mind to? You and your bloody maunderings. Stop mucking with that thing, pay some heed.
And in his anger, he might have sought to strike the ring out of Elof's hand, save that his wrist was seized in a grip that, for all his own solid strength, held him clamped like his best vice. Elof glanced up, and he sounded as grim as he looked. "You mistake me, my friend." He released his grip. "It is not that which concerns me. I have managed some work, and I had a new task to complete. What remains we can finish in time. Just. Thale was here." Rock looked at him sharply, and at the arm ring. Then his eyes widened as they took in the blankets rumpled and stained upon a bed that had manifestly not been slept in.
"Oh, ho! Was she now?"
he breathed. And so was Kara. He held up a hand to cut off Rock's exclamations. "Wait. I know now what Nethade's plans. And it is ugly. Whatever else befell, it was a mercy Bethale came when she did. Rock, there is no time left you. None at all. You are sure all is done."
"So you do want to hear, then? So be it."
It had seemed simply one of his usual errands that took Rock ashore, this time to the palace. He had delivered a minor order for necessaries, and contrived in doing so to exchange words elsewhere. It was with a full purse and a little extra effort that he had managed to entice his guards to come in search of some old friends to drink with, around the harbor quarters. So all was indeed done, and the hook swallowed.
"Just as you said. A summons to come to you. Alone and utterly in secret. All conditions as you laid them down, and at the hours you said tonight. It wasn't too well received, that. Not with the name this place has got for itself. But then I gave the rest of the message. Then I will show you a secret that shall give you mastery over your brother at a single stroke. Your very words. And didn't that summon up a grin?"
He was grinning himself as he described it, but Elof seemed grim and preoccupied, and drew little cheer from the tidings. He nodded wearily, and with an awful tenderness, he wrapped up the arm ring and put it gently aside. "Thank you. You've done well, Rock, as always. Would there were no more, that I could know you at least were safe. As you say, we must work, and not forget to make ready to receive our visitors as befits them. And you must hear of the new cloud that hangs over us, for you are proven right. Louhi has guessed where I am, and if Kara has not told her already, I fear she may now." That day's labor was the worst they had endured. All the worse for the sense of apprehension that swelled in them both. Like the heavy air before a storm, it hung about them, setting their nerves on edge, distracting their thoughts. 100 times that day they might have exploded into foolish quarrels, save that they could not waste the time. They would look up to dash sweat from weary eyes or free a cramping muscle, and their gaze would meet in a sudden mutual awareness of dread. Only once did Elof break off for what seemed to Rock no good reason, and that was to search out 2 wide silver cups, playthings he had made long since as trial pieces for a gift Nethade wished to bestow. Only at the day's end, though, did Rock find time to ask about them. Elof turned over the wide cups in his hand. They're not important in themselves, scant art and no virtue. Just a little of Nethade's silver. I mean to show him one small mercy, Rock. Rock stared.
Even after what the girl?
All the more so, though little he may appreciate it. As I said, I'll not betray those treacherous limbs of his to him. Let him go on thinking them loyal. Rock shrugged.
Why bother yourself? He's no fool. He's bound to guess the truth when he starts to think about it.
Yes, unless he cannot. Unless the shock to him is too great. So, I must see that it is. His voice faded. Rock waited, but when he spoke again, his words were brisk and lively. What's the hour?
The last before the middle hour,
Rock answered calmly.
And there's a small boat tacking in towards the west beach. They gather, Elof. Do you cool your head, and your heart'll harden once more.
2 weeks had passed since the coming of the princes to Elan Gorenhayan, and for Elof they had been 2 weeks of remorseless labor, both arduous and minute. Work that might have killed a common thrall outright. To that he had been hardened since his youth. He had made no complaint. But he was heart-weary, and that which he strove to make was not finished. Yet he must now lay all aside, for this was the night he had laid down in Rock's message, the beginning of the hour.
It's Kennerek right enough,
hissed Rock.
A showy sailor he is, but skilled to my eye. And he's taking care to hide the boat, as you asked. Aye, here he comes now.
It was not long before the younger prince stood on the threshold, his face so reddened by excitement and the climb that in the forge light he seemed to glow. A dark mantle covered his rich garments, and Elof was sure he detected the line of a mail shirt underneath them. He bowed. Enter, my lord. Surely you do not fear to come to Sorcerer's Isle when you have met the sorcerer. Kennerek scowled. I do not fear any man, but this place was so called and bore a bad name long before my father set you here. Why think you it was kept for exiles? Rock and Elof exchanged swift, significant glances, but Kennerek did not seem to notice. Nettled by any suggestion of fear, he stepped briskly into the forge and glanced about. Well, Master Valant, what's this secret you have for me? Elof bowed again and pushed back the hood from his face. It has been long and hard in the preparation, my lord. It wants only a short time more. Oh? Kennerek scowled around the forge. A wheel was turning slowly, silently, and the forge fire was glowing. But there was little else intelligible for him to see. How long? Before the middle hour, my lord. It should take shape. The prince's face cleared. Oh, well, that's well enough. You have any wine? The wine was the best Nethade had sent them, and though he made Elof taste it first, it mellowed Kennerek's mood even further. He seemed content to wander around the forge and cluck with admiration at the bits and pieces of work lying around, not least many crystals set in webs of gilded wire. He remarked how weary Elof looked, and hoped the effort would be worthwhile. At last, very close to the middle hour, Rock, whom he had disregarded completely, appeared from the shadows and bowed.
It nears completion, my lord.
Then bring it to us, said Elof quietly. My lord, we will need darkness. As you will, said the prince uneasily. Elof saw his hand settle near his sword, and smiled. Take whatever precautions you will, prince, but I shall keep my word. Kenrick nodded curtly, striving to appear unafraid. Elof lifted a long left sleeve, and darkness seemed to fall in upon the forge like a net. He heard Kenrick's sharp breath in the darkness. Silence, my lord. Only for a minute longer. Have patience. It is here. The door creaked back. A faint outline of silver in the darkness. A shadow filled it, and a heavy tread rang upon the floor. Elof drew a deep breath and let his sleeve fall back. Upon his arm was the gauntlet, his fist clenched tight upon the crystal at its heart, that only a short time since had drunk the blinding glare of a rare metal in flame. He heard Rock slam the door shut once more, and his hand flew open. The forge blazed into sight, stark and demonic in its glare, impossibly sharp and shadowless. And in that terrible clarity stood revealed, frozen and gray as a mantled statue, the shape of Gerada the Prince. For Elof's message had been delivered to them both, differing only in the time of their coming, and the place where they must land. And in that fearful light he had revealed them each to the other, beyond the reach of bluff or hypocrisy, in the very moment of their treason. So then, he cried, as the glare died, and the lights of the forge burgeoned once again. So you would think to enlist me in your treacheries, and betray me in my turn. But do you bear witness that I have kept my word? For each of you has only to draw and strike down his brother before him, and mastery shall be his indeed. They stood there, those baffled princes, for longer than Elof would have thought possible, blinded in both body and mind by the bright light of their exposure. He could measure that time by his own heartbeats, that roared so loud in his ears it seemed the walls must be shaken. Then, with perhaps a greater unison than ever in their lives before, they turned their bloodless faces upon him, and their gaze was fell. They snatched their swords from their scabbards, though Elof stood unarmed. Kenrick, who was nearest, advanced on him, breathing heavily, with the menacing pad of a cat to its kill. Elof made no move, but held him with his eyes. Gerda circled the benches to get to him, but slowly, content, it seemed, to let his brother strike first. Closer came Kenrick, till Elof could see the quiver of his lower lip and the tears of rage hot in his eyes. Then he swung up his sword and brought it down upon Elof's unguarded head. Like a snake striking, the gauntlet sprang into the way. The blade passed between fingers and thumb and struck the pale jewel in the palm. And there it lodged without even a sound as the fingers clamped tight, for the jewel had drunk the force of the blow. Elof clutched the blade, twisting it, pressing it back with a strength so great that his left arm prevailed over both of Kenrick's. The prince saw what promised. His mouth fell open to shriek, but then Elof unclamped his grip. The blow had not been so hard, for though both princes were polished swordsmen, They had seldom, if ever, had to fight in earnest, but it would have served to split a skull. Now, though, the blade was turned back against its wielder while it was still in his hand, and its force unleashed. Straight through Kennerec's throat it struck, and in a great spray of blood, his head flew from his shoulders and went bouncing away across a bench. His body dropped convulsing to the sanded floor. Gerda sprang back, remembering all too late that he had to deal not with a helpless cripple, but a sorcerer of craft and might. He sought to break for the door, but found himself facing Rock, grim-faced, his heavy longbow drawn to shoulder. He wailed like a beast, and raised his sword as if to throw it, then whirled about and hurled himself with desperate frenzy on Elof. Elof seized his sword wrist as he struck, but the impact knocked him off his precarious balance, back against the great anvil. Kennerec's dark-smeared sword lay almost at his feet, but as he sought to stoop for it, Gerda's other hand clamped tight on his. Fighting to stay on his feet, Elof could not bring his greater strength to bear, and so they swayed there, locked together for what seemed an eternity, though Rock had barely time to down his bow and swing a forge spike. Gerda was screaming like a lunatic into Elof's face, spraying him with foam and spittle, snapping at his throat like a wolf, while Elof's back creaked agonizingly under both their weights against the sharp edge of the anvil. It might have gone hard with Elof, unable to use his legs, but Gerda, desperate to escape, suddenly let go of Elof's wrist and twisted to snatch a poniard from his belt. Even that slight relaxation was enough. As he raised the dagger, Elof's powerful fingers clenched in the gaudy slashes of his jerkin and thrust him back, staggering. Then they jerked him forward and to one side. The anvil's edge caught the taller man in the midriff, and he folded over it with an impact that drove the wind from his lungs. Elof stooped with an equally painful gasp, and even as Gerda rolled over, wheezing, to bring his blade across in a slashing cut, Kennerec's sword glittered high against the shadowy roof. So near came Gerda's sword that it slashed Elof's robe across and left a deep scratch over his ribs. Kenneric smashed down upon the anvil with a dreadful clang. It was not a blade of Elof's making. It shivered like glass into flying fragments against the time-tempered iron. But it had done its work. Gerda's blade clattered to the ground, slowly, leaving a great smear of blood like the trail of some unclean creature. His body slid down off the anvil, nerveless fingers scrabbling weakly at the iron. Rock exclaimed in disgust at the head that rolled past his feet. But Elof paid him no heed. The bare hilt dropped from his hand, and he tore off the ruined robe and cast it across the severed heads as they lay. With a strength that appalled Rock, he seized a limp arm and began to drag the corpses to the back of the forge. Rock bent to help, but Elof waved him away. "This is for me to endure. Do you keep your hands clean of it." Rock shuddered as he heard the furnace door creak back on its hinges, and sounds first of one heavy fall, then another, and at last the deep, dull clang of the closing door, final and dreadful as a passing bell. A wheel spun, chains clanked and rattled, the floor trembled, and the leaves of silver writhed and curled like their live selves caught in an autumn fire. Then, letting fall his props, Elof half sat, half fell upon the seat of bricks at the hearth. For long minutes he huddled there, head bowed, the back of his hand to his lips, as if listening to that devouring roar beneath.
"Well,"
demanded Rock.
"not having second thoughts, are you?"
Elof shook his head. "No," he said. His voice was steady, though very bleak. "All other gates are closed to us now. Some blood splashed upon my lips, that is all, and it has a bitter tang." Rock nodded.
"They say that it does,"
He said.
"I'd better look to my packing now."
It did not take him long. When his pack was full, he gathered up his steel-shod bow from the floor, unstrung it and brushed it clean, and slung it carefully on its quiver at his back. Only then did he turn back to Elof, and found he also had been busy. Of the robe there was no sign, but by Elof's side was a good-sized casket of plain wood, with a richly worked clasp. Rock hefted the pack.
"Time I was away."
"Aye," said Elof quietly. "High time." He lifted the box. "You know what you must do with this?" Rock took it gingerly, made as if to open the catch. Elof's hand restrained him. Rock tapped his foot a moment, considering.
"I'll take Kennerec's little boat. It looks handier for a no-sailor like me. Gerda's I'll leave for you, just in case."
"No. Do you scuttle it, or set it adrift in the channel. I am weary, Rock, bitterly weary, of suffering and of making others suffer." From the breast of his tunic, Elof took the feather Kara had let fall, and beside it another almost as black, but with a faint sheen of gold. If I succeed, well and good. If I fail, I fail.
"But our warning."
That burden falls on you then. Steer as truly westward as you can. Air to the north, if anything. At worst, follow the margins of the ice.
"If we make it in time,"
said Rock quietly.
"All right. West and north. I'll try."
Elof heaved himself up suddenly, and caught the shorter man by his broad shoulders. "Rock, fare you well. Truly well. 100 times you've been my good fortune. The powers know you've earned some of your own." Rock cocked his head to one side and grinned.
"It's not every forge hand gets to serve such a master. That they know also. Whatever else, it's never been dull."
He clapped Elof on the arm with his own heavy hand and turned away. At the door he paused, then flung it wide and filled his lungs with the clean night air.
"Ah, I'd all but forgotten how fresh a tang it has. Freedom. Fare you well also, Master Smith."
He closed the door softly behind him, and left Elof alone among the muted thunder of the forge. Elof sat a while, feeling more profoundly alone than ever in his life before, and then wearily he rose and began to sweep the bloody muck from the floor. In its place he sprinkled clean silver sand. The hardened earth beneath had drunk its fill, and the stains did not reappear. That luxury he allowed himself, meaningless though it was. Then he threw himself into his labors once more. He had lingered long ere he opened the furnace, almost too long. He felt the earth tides fight him at the door, and when he at last went down the steps, he heard their grinding thunders behind it. But they hardly stirred the pile of cooling slag at his feet. All through the night he labored, pausing only to gulp down a cup of wine, a morsel of meat, whenever the work allowed him. The work grew in his mind, under his hands, till it seemed to fill the whole universe. He almost forgot there was anywhere beyond the stifling forge, any future beyond its completion. He hummed at first as he labored, and soon he was singing with little heed of the smoky airs that arose from the furnace to claw his throat and burn in his breast. Into that song he poured his heart, a lilting, ecstatic music of joy that knew nothing of treasons and bloodshed, that soared high above the somber vault of fire and the toil that scorched his flesh and drew blood even from his hardened fingers. I am a leaf on the storm wind, sailing, sailing. I am a flame on a feather, on the wide air, dancing, dancing. I am a cloud on an east wind, bearing me homeward, singing, singing. And into the work that song was woven. Yet for all his absorption, in some remote corner of his thoughts, he could not help imagining the train of events he had set in motion, so minutely that he seemed actually to be seeing them all, building up like strange simultaneous layers of motion. He saw Rock's little boat glide across the dark Iascianus to shore, beaching clumsily, no doubt, but safe. Rock leaving the casket with some of the gate guards he knew, repeating the instructions on its lid that it was for Nithade's eyes only, and then melting away into the end of the dark. Taking to the boat again, though not for long. Rock would sooner make his way ashore. Rock on his way, the casket borne by mounted courier through the sleeping streets of that immense city to the walls of the strength of Charis, and within, to await the coming of the king. He saw the sun arise over the horns of the bull more clearly than through his own shutters, his own eyes blind to all except the piecing together of things delicate into a binding whole. But then it grew less certain. Nithade might return by water, sailing leisurely up the channels, or by land to ride in triumph through the streets and enjoy the acclamation of his people. That was more likely, now that he brought peace to offer them, and the appearance, at least, of victory. He would come by the westward gates, then, and reach the palace sooner, about midday, perhaps. He would find troubled faces awaiting him. The princes would have been missed by then. Perhaps Bethael would tell then, something at least. They would bring Nithade the casket. Elof swallowed and bent himself to his labors. That scene he had no wish to see. Ironic that mercy should be cloaked thus in the appearance of fiendish cruelty. Or was it mercy? A strange kind, if so, twisted and deformed. But so Nithade had made him, and must take his mercy as it came. He could not banish it from his mind. Nithade, grim-faced, being handed the box, the courtiers who gave it melting away into the crowd, beyond the reach of his wrath. Nithade, pale and apprehensive, balancing the box on his knees against his bloated belly, hesitating, then angrily snapping back the catch and swinging up the lid. Elof started and almost burned himself on the furnace's outer door. There, in the two wide cups, with clasps of gems and gold to weight down their eyes, to uphold the sagging jaws, the severed heads of his two beloved sons. Even in memory, that vision almost unmanned Elof. Yet without it, the king must begin to wonder how Elof had enticed his sons. And inevitably, somebody would talk. Now, though, there would be room only for horror and grief, agonies of grief, and then wrath such as even Nethade had rarely displayed. Wrath against Valent the Dark Sorcerer, Valent the Murderer. He would draw the black blade, and then... Soon? How soon? Elof threw back the shutters and was appalled. The sun was already past its zenith. Little time remained. Hastily he flung back the furnace door and smelt the hair scorching on his hands in the air that blasted by. The inner door must be scarcely closed. Most of the delicate work was finished, woven already into the web of the whole. What remained was chiefly smith's work, making joint and frame strong and true against the forces they must endure. But that he must manage soon, soon. He glanced at the stalks, at the leaves that clung curled, and bit his lip. He could not wait for it to cool. He gathered up his tool pack, the arm ring. After a slight hesitation, he looped around the chain at his neck, for it was too small for either arm. He had not expected to feel anything, yet he was aware of a sudden strengthening, a reinforcement of his will, as if the power he had poured into that gold long ago had returned to him now. Over his left hand he drew the gauntlet, and slowly, carefully, he heaved himself over the hot metal rim and down into the depths of the forge. The walls were shaking around him now with the thunder of the earth fires, but he set his hammers as counterpoint against them. After a while, though, it came to him that the little chamber was growing hotter, not cooler. He paused in his hammering to risk a glance over his shoulder, saw the inner door too hot to touch, the layers of dross beneath it still aglow. He could guess what had happened. He had left the door open too long, and the earth fires had broken through whatever restraints the original builder had placed there. Now they must be welling up directly against the far side of the door. Even as he looked on it, it began to change color slightly, developing the dull bloom of heat. No matter. It would hold long enough. Longer than he, perhaps. Every breath seemed to sear his lungs. He set his teeth, still humming his tune, varying it, broadening it, and finding words for its sweeping coda. Far from here bear me now, off to the smiling land of the spring, where what is lost I regain, and more than I was, I become. He hammered with redoubled urgency, shaping and forming metal uncannily obdurate for all its lightness into the last fine welds of a framework for a light corsetlet of mail. The crashing chime of his blows rang dizzyingly around the stone walls. Would they hear it, out there upon the great river, and look up to see the plumes of smoke, the red glow atop the shadowed crest of Elan Gorenhayen? Would they pull their oars to that frantic hammering time as their king urged them on, threatening, promising, half crazy with his wrath? He could see them as the thought came, the galley leaping through the water, the wavelets hissing and booming beneath its bouncing hull, its bows stirring the shallows, growling hollowly as they clove through the gravelly sand of the beach. Nethade now, leaping the gunwale into the shallows, his warriors at his heels, charging without pause up the slopes of the Sorcerer's Isle. And in that moment, it came to Elof that he was seeing a truth, a vision that was happening. And even as the metal leaped and twisted beneath his hand, he listened for the roar of voices, the thunder of feet on the floor above. It came swiftly. Nithade, for all his years in the bull's armor he bore, must have made an almost unhuman pace up that slope, borne along by the wrath that boiled in his brain.
"Valant!"
he screamed, while he was yet some distance away.
"Come hither and be paid for the jewels you sent me! Valant! Valant!"
His voice had a shriek in it like that of a man racked to the tearing point. It froze Elof's heart.
"Come hither, you skulking slayer! Coward! Come forth!"
Already he was nearer. He must be running like a man possessed. Running as once Elof could have, 8 years past, on 2 strong legs. His teeth ground with fury. 8 long years of misery, loss, and torment. He beat them out beneath his hand. With his last few strokes, he hammered them away.
"Valant! Come forth!"
It was Nithade's weight alone that crashed against the sun symbol on the door and tore the whole thing from its hinges. His onrush carried him stumbling into the forge, crashing over table and bench before he could stop, staring at the red-lit smoke cloud that came boiling up into the empty room and swirled beneath the roof, as a rumble like unending thunder shook the walls. But against this sorcery, he swung up his shield and shrieked,
"Stay, fiend, and fight! My hounds have a claim on your carcass!"
Then, out of the cloud as it seemed, a voice answered him. His guards heard it, as they came running up behind him. And though it had seemed to them till then that no voice could be more terrible than Nithade in his torment, yet this one stopped them in their very stride, as they came spilling into the forge. Where his was crazed, it echoed bleakly calm. Where his screamed, it spoke in tones elegiac, dark, and measured. But they quailed all alike at the pain it bore, and the judgment it pronounced remorseless, final as a passing bell. "Unworthy borrower of your name, oppressor of the land you rule, king without honor, truth, or shame, the measure of your crime is full." Nithade beheld, in that last instant, a dark shape rise amid the glowing center of the cloud, shadowy, formless, unlike a man's. Then, with a last deafening roar, the floor before it split with a line of fire and collapsed, caved inward beneath him in a roar of incandescent smoke. Into the gap slid benches and tables, sweeping men with them. The wheels and engines, baked dry by long heat, burst into flames and toppled. The trough split and the water blasted out into scalding steam. Tongues of flame roared against the roof and fired it. Great cracks raced up the walls, and they too sagged and split. Before any in the forge could move, those immense timbers of the roof shook free and dropped like the very props of the sky itself. Then toppled the upper walls, and with a crash and a roar, the whole forge crumbled like a hollow coal, and fell inward in a thunderous fountain of smoke and flame. All the soldiers outside sprang back, dragging with them comrades who had leaped free at the last moment, escaping with bruise and burn. But they knew their Lord was within, and they did not flee. Not at once, not until one cried and pointed, and they saw the figure that rose out of that incandescent ruin. In man's shape it was, yet more than man, for on immense wings, pinions of shining black shot with gleams of gold, anchored in harness set with glittering crystals, it arose radiant into the rich evening light. Most fled at the very sight of it, but some stayed to cast their spears or shoot, for they were brave men. But from one outstretched arm, sheathed in metal, a spear of fire sprang that blasted the grass before them. Then all who could turned and ran for their ship. But Elof, rejoicing in the surge and power of wings once more, paid them no heed, for he was searching the wreckage, and called aloud the name, Gorthar! A gleam like a night of stars shone out in answer, and a faint, broken hail. Men, looking back, saw him glide down like a gigantic eagle, and they shuddered and ran on. But Elof came low and hovered, and made out amid a great mass of rubble that shimmer of darkness, and not far from it, Nethade's tortured face. One side of it was crushed and eyeless, the heavy locks matted dark with ashes. Yet he lived, and saw, and as the wind of the vast wings blew back the dust around him, his lips moved. Your armor was made well, yet your revenge bitter. Leave my people lordless before the ice. Elof reached down among the rubble and plucked out the black sword, unmarked, unmarred, and the silver of the hilt poured a healing marshland coolness into his hands so sorely burned. No king, he cried, for better or for worse, I go now to bring them a worthier lord. Die in peace. In the ashes there lie with your kin, for them you fought and schemed so long. Now together you all may find rest. Slowly now he arose, higher and higher into the sky, and as he gained full mastery of the great work he had labored on so long, he turned as a bird turns, and flew off westwards towards the setting of the sun.